Hello there, I'm Dan, and I'm here to guide you through history's darkest detour, and welcome to the channel, where today's story begins with this unsettling truth. During the Black Death, the city of Ragusa invented the world's first mandatory 30-day waiting period for travellers, not for relaxation, but because absolutely no one trusted anyone arriving by boat. If that already surprises you, stick around. This journey gets much stranger. And before we dive in, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment down below when and where you're listening from. I'd love to know who's brave enough to join us on this medieval survival tour. Before the plague ever arrives, before a sailor coughs in the wrong direction, or a rat decides to hitch a ride on a bale of grain, your medieval European city has already prepared the stage for disaster, with the enthusiasm of a festival planner who doesn't yet realise the festival is for germs. Survival, at this point, has nothing to do with spotting symptoms or recognising buboes, because there aren't any yet. What you do have is a world so crowded, so lively and so aromatic that even the bacteria haven't shown up but would absolutely love it here when they do. Let's start with the basics. Space. Specifically, the lack of it. Medieval cities are like sardine tins, only sardines enjoy more personal room. Streets are narrow, houses lean inward like two exhausted drunks holding each other up, and the population density can reach astonishing levels in city centres. Privacy in practice doesn't exist. You know your neighbours intimately, not because you want to, but because your walls are thin and life is loud. When you sneeze, the three families next door say bless you before you even finish exhaling. It's charming in one way and catastrophic in another, the another being everything related to disease. Then there's trade, the thing everyone is very proud of. And fair enough, your city is thriving, with merchants pouring in from across Europe, the Mediterranean and beyond. Ships unload fabrics, spices, ceramics, metal goods, and also things no one asked for, like fleas and rats with very busy social lives. Market squares overflow with people jostling shoulder to shoulder, shouting prices, slapping fish on tables, cutting open carcasses, and occasionally arguing over which saint is responsible for controlling the weather. Every handshake is meaningful. Every shared cup is communal. Every crowd is a germs version of a spa resort. And speaking of crowds, let's discuss livestock inside the city walls. Because yes, it's not just the humans who live here. Chickens wander into streets like they own the place. Pigs rummage in refuse piles with the confidence of professional sanitation workers. Goats wander freely, and cows sometimes end up inside kitchens because the door was open and the cow was curious. Horses constantly clatter past, contributing an endless supply of manure that no one has time to clean promptly. It's not just a city, it's a four-legged convention with no registration fee. Hygiene is where things get particularly adventurous. Bathhouses exist, but they're not always open, affordable, or trusted. Some moralists warn that excessive bathing is dangerous, which is a helpful argument if you don't feel like washing anyway. Streets double as gutters. Chamber pots are emptied out of upper-story windows with the subtlety of a water balloon ambush. The smell of the city is a signature blend of sweat, animals, refuse, and whatever died behind the tannery last week. People don't have hand-washing routines. Instead, they have a philosophy that dirt is warm and warmth is good. Of course, the sewage system, or lack thereof, plays a starring role. Many cities have open drains, shallow troughs running down the centre of the street, designed to whisk away waste, but more often just relocating it. When it rains, the city gets a free flush. When it doesn't, the streets ripen spectacularly. Children play near these drains. Adults step over them casually. Dogs roll in them enthusiastically. Sanitation, as a concept, is still several centuries and a lot of unfortunate epidemics away. But here's the thing, medieval people don't see a death trap. They see a booming city full of opportunity. This is the economic heartland, a place where fortunes are won, marriages arranged, guilds founded, and gossip spreads faster than anything biological ever could. Life feels stable, bustling and familiar. People wake to the sound of merchants setting up their stalls, horses carting goods, church bells ringing, and neighbours shouting friendly insults out their windows, This is home, and nobody questions its fragile foundations. Yet, beneath the noise and commerce, your city is already primed for a biological catastrophe. The density, the animals, the waste, the trade networks that connect cities across continents. These form a perfect latticework through which any infectious agent could travel effortlessly. You don't know it, but the conditions around you are like a recipe book for future disaster. Step 1, add humans. Step 2, add animals. Step 3, add movement. Step 4, forget hygiene. Step 5, stir vigorously. None of this is intentional, of course. Medieval Europeans aren't thinking about microbes. They don't know microbes exist. They judge cleanliness by what they can see and smell, and unfortunately a lot of danger in this era is microscopic and unscented. But the city is alive, vibrant, chaotic, filthy, interdependent, and it is precisely that aliveness that will make it such an efficient engine for death once the first infected sailor collapses at a dock hundreds of miles away. For now, though, life goes on. You wake up, step over the chicken blocking your doorway, greet your neighbour who's already yelling about bread prices, and inhale a city that smells like ambition, livestock, and poor decisions stacked on top of one another. The good news? Your town is thriving. The bad news? So is the part of it that smells like a wet goat. Before the plague becomes a tidal wave across Europe, before mass graves and city ordinances and frantic prayers, everything begins with something so small you couldn't see it even if you squinted hard enough to sprain an eyeball. Its name is Yersinia pestis, a bacterium with absolutely no respect for human boundaries, long-term planning, or basic decency. It does not negotiate, it does not warn. It simply arrives, multiplies, and ruins your entire week. Let's start with the basics. Yersinia pestis isn't a virus, a curse, a punishment from heaven, or the result of someone forgetting to pay their tithes. Though plenty of medieval people will confidently play theological detective later. It is a gram-negative coccobacillus, which is a fancy modern way of saying a tiny shape-shifting speck of microbial chaos. On its own, it is harmless looking. Under a microscope it resembles a little capsule, an innocent jelly bean of doom. But inside a human body it becomes an absolute tyrant. The moment why. Pestis enters your system, usually through the bite of an infected flea. It begins to behave like a petty warlord. It travels through your lymphatic network, which is supposed to help your body fight infections, not host them. This is like hiring someone to guard your house only to discover they're using your living room as a warehouse for flamethrowers. The first sign something is wrong is subtle. Maybe you feel tired, maybe you have a headache, maybe you simply assume the weather is bad, your neighbour has annoyed you again, or your breakfast wasn't as energising as you hoped. Which is understandable, considering breakfast in the 1300s often consisted of stale bread masquerading as a meal. But then very quickly things escalate. Because here's the cold clinical reality. The incubation period for bubonic plague is typically 1 to 7 days. One day you're fine, the next your body's hosting a bacterial block party. It's fast, explosive and deeply unfair. Medieval life already has enough surprises. Falling masonry, runaway pigs, surprise taxes, so adding catastrophic lymphatic failure within a week is particularly rude. And then come the buboes. A bubo is a swollen, agonising lymph node, most commonly appearing in the groin, armpit or neck. So enlarged it looks like your body is trying to grow a second, angrier version of an organ you already have. These swellings can reach the size of an egg, or an apple, or, in some chroniclers' descriptions, a small fist, which is a phrase no one wants to hear from either a doctor or a poet. Touching a bubo is a terrible idea. Looking at a bubo is enough to make a hardened medieval soldier reconsider his life choices. The skin around it reddens, stretches and throbs. The pain is described in later accounts as unbearable, the kind that makes even tough farmers, who can normally shrug off falling off carts or stepping on their own pitchforks, cry like children. And remember, medieval Europe has no anaesthesia unless you count passing out from agony, which to be fair is sometimes the best case scenario. Bubonic plague gets most of the dramatic attention, but its sibling is far more terrifying, pneumonic plague. If bubonic plague feels like your lymph nodes are going on strike, pneumonic plague is your lungs handing in a resignation letter written in blood. Unlike the bubonic form, which needs fleas and bites and a certain amount of bad luck to spread, pneumonic plague can travel directly from person to person through respiratory droplets, coughing and speaking, or being within the medieval equivalent of personal space, which is very close because everyone lives on top of each other. Pneumonic plague develops faster, hits harder, and kills quicker. Symptoms include fever, chest pain, and coughing up blood. It's not subtle. If bubonic plague gives you days to realise your life is falling apart, pneumonic plague gives you hours. Imagine trying to survive in a city so densely packed that you can't walk 5 steps without brushing someone's sleeve. Now imagine that every cough could be a death sentence. It's the medieval version of a nightmare speedrun. For those keeping score, there is also septicemic plague, where the bacteria overwhelm the bloodstream directly. But septicemic plague is more of a surprise final boss, fast, devastating, and often killing before buboes even have time to appear. The only reason it doesn't get top billing in medieval chronicles is because victims rarely lived long enough to describe it. Now, what makes Yersinia pestis so uniquely catastrophic isn't just the bacteria itself, it's how your body responds to it. Your immune system, desperate to fight back, triggers inflammatory responses that can become lethal on their own. Your blood vessels leak fluid, your tissues begin to die, fever skyrockets, you become weak, delirious and disoriented. Everything hurts, everything feels wrong. And all of this is happening inside a world where most people believe disease comes from foul smells, misalignment of the planets, or divine irritation. This is why Yersinia pestis has such an advantage. It thrives in confusion. It thrives where symptoms are misunderstood. It thrives in places where no one can see the true enemy, because the enemy is microscopic, silent, and already inside you by the time you feel ill. Medieval chroniclers, to their credit, knew something was horribly unnatural. They described the swellings, the blackened extremities, the fevers, the speed. They observed patterns but lacked the tools to interpret them. Had they known about bacteria, contagion or incubation periods, their survival strategies might have shifted. Instead, all they knew was that an invisible force seemed to choose victims at random, ruthlessly, unpredictably, horribly. And so the plague spreads, city to city, body to body, symptom to symptom. Monday you're fine. By Thursday your lymph nodes are filing for independence. The enemy has been introduced. What comes next is what happens when that enemy meets the medieval world, one unprepared household at a time. If surviving medieval Europe during the plague were a game, it would already be unfair. You're dealing with poverty, overcrowded homes, questionable sanitation, and a bacterium with the personal boundaries of a drunk goat. But Yersinia pestis doesn't stop at one playstyle. No, this overachiever comes with 2 terrifying modes, each with its own personality, tempo, and method of reducing your household to chaos. First, there's bubonic plague, the version most people picture. It's the one with the telltale buboes, the swollen, painful lymph nodes that balloon beneath the skin like someone tried to inflate your armpit for sport. Bubonic plague takes its time, relatively speaking. You can go to bed feeling slightly off. Spend a day insisting you're fine, and only then find yourself clutching at a swollen lump the size of a bird's egg and reconsidering every decision you've ever made. This form usually begins with a fever, chills, fatigue, and an intense desire to lie very still and hope the world stops happening for a while. Soon the swelling starts, the pain radiates, your skin reddens, the entire area becomes so sensitive that even brushing against fabric feels like betrayal. Bubonic plague is horrific, but at least it gives you a miserable kind of warning. It escalates fast, yes, but it doesn't necessarily knock your entire family down in a single day. Pneumonic plague, however, plays by different rules. If bubonic plague is a brutal mugging, pneumonic plague is an ambush. It doesn't require fleas. It doesn't require bites. It doesn't require proximity to a rat that's been living under your floorboard since winter. All it requires is air, the one thing every medieval household has generously and recklessly shared for generations. Pneumonic plague is what happens when Yersinia pestis decides lungs are its favourite playground. Once inside the respiratory system, it attacks with alarming speed. Victims develop a sudden high fever, chills, chest pain, and a cough that quickly evolves into something far more sinister: bloody sputum, the most dreadful calling card of the disease. For medieval families, this is the moment when fear shifts from dread to pure panic. Because what sets pneumonic plague apart is this: it can spread directly from one person to another through droplets, not through fleas, not through rats, not through mysterious miasmas drifting through alleys, just exhaled breath, a cough, a wheeze, a shouted greeting across a crowded room, an argument over bread prices, a whispered prayer. All of these could be the beginning of an outbreak that tears through a household before anyone realises what's happening. This is why some medieval families seem to collapse with incredible speed. Chroniclers write about entire homes where every person fell sick within hours, not days. Stories in which one member begins coughing at dawn and by sunset several others are delirious with fever. It's not superstition or exaggeration, it's pneumonic plague's merciless efficiency. In households where space is scarce, beds are shared, windows barely exist, and everyone breathes each other's air as a matter of daily routine. The disease doesn't spread, it detonates. Under bubonic plague, a family might have time to react. There's an initial case, a period of concern, maybe even a chance to seek help or isolate the sick, as much as medieval homes allow isolation, which is to say, barely. But pneumonic plague laughs at the idea of reaction time. It turns a single illness into a family-wide disaster in less than a day. If bubonic plague whispers, pneumonic plague yells. And the worst part: medieval people did not know the difference. All they could observe was that sometimes people developed swellings and lingered for days, and other times they began coughing in the morning and were dead before the next bell rang. The unpredictability didn't just create fear, it created stories, rumours, theories, and desperate attempts to find patterns in something that had none. One household dies slowly, another disappears in a blink. How do you prepare for something that refuses to behave the same way twice? Pneumonic plague also changes the psychology of survival. Under bubonic plague, people fear proximity to filth, rats, refuse, and anything that smells like neglect. Fear shaped by the belief in miasma. But pneumonic plague turns every human being into a potential threat. A loved one's breath could be lethal. A neighbour's greeting could carry doom. You can avoid the market, avoid livestock, avoid strange travellers, but you can't avoid the air. This creates a paradoxical form of fear in the medieval household. The same closeness that once represented warmth, security, and community becomes a liability. Large families, once prized for economic resilience, now become red zones for infection. Shared bedding, shared tools, shared meals, everything that defines daily life becomes a vector. In this way, pneumonic plague doesn't just attack the lungs, it attacks the structure of medieval domestic life. It forces people to view their most intimate spaces as hostile terrain. Some households attempt to isolate members, an almost impossible task in rooms the size of a modern closet. Others try desperate remedies, herbal fumigations, charms, or simply prayer. Many tragically have no time to try anything at all. This is why the fear around pneumonic plague is different from the fear of bubonic plague. Bubonic plague is terrifying, but you can see it coming. You can point to a swelling and say, "That's not good." Pneumonic plague is invisible until it explodes. It doesn't look like a threat until it already is one. Bubonic is the one with the swelling. Pneumonic is the one that turns your neighbour into a sneeze with a schedule. And in a world where walls are thin, air is shared, and medicine is theory at best, this distinction means everything, because it determines whether a household has days to react, or none at all. Before the plague sweeps into Europe like a continent-wide eviction notice, its most dramatic and most debated origin story unfolds at the edges of the Black Sea, in the bustling fortified trading hub of Kaffa. The year is 1346, and two forces are locked in conflict: the Genoese merchants defending their profitable colony, and the Mongol-led forces of the Golden Horde, commanded by Janibeg, who has decided that this particular port town is just too strategically valuable to leave alone. The scene is already cinematic: high stone walls, archers firing from battlements, ships poised in the harbour waiting for the slightest chance to escape, and armies encamped outside like an uninvited guest who refuses to take the hint. But then, according to one widely circulated account, something extraordinary and grotesque happens. The Mongol army begins to fall sick, not with a normal battlefield illness, but with a fast, devastating disease that kills soldiers faster than commanders can issue orders. The army's rotting from the inside out, and just when it seems like the siege might dissolve from sheer biological collapse, a chronicler named Gabriele de Mussi writes that the Mongols decide, essentially, if we're going down, we're taking everyone with us. The alleged method: catapult the plague-ridden corpses over Kaffa's defensive walls. This is, undeniably, one of history's most gripping images: men launching the dead as weapons, bodies arcing across the sky, landing inside the panicked city like biological meteors. It is the kind of moment that makes historians wince even as filmmakers take notes. If you've ever wondered what medieval psychological warfare looked like at its most unhinged, well, there you go. There's just one problem: this entire episode might not have happened, or it might have happened differently, or it might have been deeply exaggerated, and this is where the story takes a sharp turn from dramatic to controversial. The catapult narrative comes primarily from de Mussi, who was not an eyewitness. He was a notary living in Piacenza, hundreds of miles away, writing after the fact, possibly using second-hand reports, rumours, or the medieval equivalent of someone insisting. My cousin's friend swears this is true. Chroniclers of the era often blended fact, morality, theology, exaggeration, and a pinch of flair, especially when recounting events that symbolise divine punishment or moral decline. So scholars ask several important questions. Would the Mongols really have flung decomposing bodies over walls when decomposition can make corpses structurally, let's say, catapult unfriendly? Would the defenders have been significantly affected, given that direct contact with bodily fluids is a more reliable transmission route than simply having a corpse land nearby? Could de Mussi have been using the story as a moral allegory, framing the plague as something deliberately hurled at Christians by non-Christians? And then there's the biggest question of all: do we even need this story to explain how the plague reached Europe? The answer is, not really. Trade networks alone provide more than enough transmission paths. Fleas, rats, and goods move constantly between the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, and European ports. Even if the corpse catapult moment never occurred, the plague would still have spread through established commercial routes. Yet the story persists. Why? Because it feels like a perfect origin myth. Medieval warfare meeting microbial catastrophe. It's gory, dramatic, symbolically charged, and easy to remember. It turns disease into a weapon, a siege into a legend, and an outbreak into a moral tale about human cruelty. It's the kind of story that sticks, even if historians raise one eyebrow so high it nearly leaves their forehead. Then a modern scholarship tends to treat the event with what can politely be called critical skepticism. Some historians argue that flinging bodies may indeed have happened in small numbers as harassment or demoralization tactics, but not as the primary mechanism of plague transmission. Others argue the entire anecdote is simply too convenient, too theatrical, too narratively tidy to trust. After all, medieval chroniclers loved a good plot twist, especially one involving divine retribution. What isn't debated is this: by 1346, plague was present in the region. Whether through siege conditions, trade interactions, or general proximity, Kaffa became one of the earliest recorded sites where plague and European merchants intersected. Ships fleeing the siege carried goods, sailors, stories, and almost certainly the microscopic passengers that would soon reshape the continent. But the idea of bodies flying over walls? That remains part of the fascinating grey zone of medieval history, where fact and storytelling share a room, fight over the covers, and occasionally collaborate on a horror novel. And from a narrative perspective, the controversy is almost more interesting than the act itself. It shows how quickly fear shapes memory. It shows how stories travel faster than armies. It shows how easy it is for one dramatic account to overshadow an entire complex network of epidemiological reality. Most importantly, it reminds us how medieval observers tried to find meaning in chaos, even if the meaning came packaged as airborne cadavers. So did it happen? Maybe. Possibly. We can't rule it out. We can't confirm it either. It sits in that tantalising space where history and myth shake hands. But one thing is certain. Whether or not corpses actually flew, the plague did, metaphorically speaking. It moved across borders, across seas, across cultures, unstoppable, not because someone hurled a body, but because medieval life was perfectly designed for microbial chaos. Still, the story endures because, frankly, it has an irresistible punchline. It's medieval warfare. When you're out of rocks, you upgrade to rumours and biology. If the Siege of Caiaphas is the dramatic prelude whispered about in chronicles, then October 1347 in the port of Messina is the moment the curtain actually rises on the European catastrophe. This is the hinge in the story, the instant when a local crisis becomes a continental one, and it begins not with a battle or a miracle or a heavenly omen, but with something far more mundane and far more dangerous: ships. Messina is a thriving Sicilian port city in 1347, pulsing with trade that connects it to the wider Mediterranean world. Its harbour is a crossroads of cargo, sailors, languages, and gossip. Wooden masts crowd the shoreline, rigging creaks in the wind, merchants haggle over goods, and stevedores stomp up and down gangplanks carrying everything from wool bales to amphorae. Messina is alive, busy, bustling, interconnected, which is exactly what will make it so vulnerable. Because in October 1347, a fleet of Genoese ships arrives unexpectedly, battered by storms, conflict, and something far worse. Chroniclers describe them limping into port, their crews visibly sick, their decks thinner than they should be. These sailors, desperate and exhausted, are seeking refuge. Nay, to the people of Messina, the ships are a sign of commerce continuing, goods incoming, business as usual. It is not business as usual. The moment the ships anchor, observers notice something deeply wrong. Sailors stagger ashore with fevers, blackened swellings, and visible exhaustion. Some die before they can speak a word. Others collapse on the docks. The crew members who remain upright look haunted, pale, sweating, delirious. No one in Messina can diagnose what's happening, but they can see, immediately, that it is bad. And then it begins. The outbreak spreads through the city with alarming speed. Households that had never heard of Kaffa or cared about distant wars now find themselves nursing family members who go from slightly unwell to making final confessions in a matter of days. The disease moves through districts like fire through dry brush. Fear spikes, trade halts, religious processions spring into motion, bells toll, physicians get overwhelmed. Everyone is suddenly aware of how small and fragile the city really is. This moment becomes one of the earliest firmly anchored points in the European timeline of the Black Death. October 1347, Messina. The door swings open. But the real engine behind the disaster isn't just the sickness, it's the port itself. Ports are medieval Europe's superhighways. Goods, people, animals, and information flow in and out constantly. A bag of grain on Monday could be bread on Tuesday, horse feed on Wednesday, and part of a cargo shipment to Naples on Thursday. A sailor sick in Messina could carry disease into a boarding house, a tavern, a marketplace, a church. A merchant who survived the journey could laugh over wine with friends in the evening and wake up the next morning in a fever he doesn't yet understand. Trade makes cities prosper, but it is also the perfect transmission infrastructure for disease. Ships concentrate people in close quarters, often for days or weeks. Rats stow away unnoticed. Fleas thrive in the warm, sheltered, fabric-rich environment of ship hulls. When the ship docks, the ecosystem, human, animal and microbial, travels with it. In an era without germ theory, without quarantine protocols, and without any idea that diseases might travel with passengers, ports are wide open doors. They're gateways, not just for goods, but for pathogens that hitchhike invisibly, silently, relentlessly. Messina, by virtue of being a successful port, becomes the first major European victim. And the reaction? Immediate, violent, desperate. Once the citizens realise the sailors have brought something lethal, the ships are ordered to leave. Chroniclers say they are expelled from the harbour, pushed back out to sea like floating plague bombs. But the damage is already done. The bacteria is ashore, the outbreak has begun, and those fleeing ships forced to continue their journey will carry the plague to other Mediterranean ports, Genoa, Venice, Marseille, each in turn becoming the next chapter in the chain reaction. The irony is brutal. The same trade networks that enrich these cities now become the veins through which the plague circulates. To survive Messina in October 1347 would require not just luck but almost supernatural foresight, an ability to recognise that the harbour, once a symbol of prosperity, has transformed overnight into a biological hurricane. Families might try to flee inland, but roads are busy, rumours chaotic and fear spreading faster than people can outrun it. Some pray, some barricade themselves indoors, some attempt remedies, but no one, absolutely no one, understands just how big this event is or how fast it is about to accelerate. Because after Messina, there is no slowing down. The ships expelled from the port become moving vectors. The disease rides with them to other cities. Once those cities ignite, their own ships carry it to still more places. The maritime world becomes a relay race of unintended contagion, and Messina stands at the starting line. It is the beginning of the European catastrophe, not with a grand battle or a dramatic omen or a heavenly fireball, but with something much simpler, and therefore more terrifying. A routine docking of ships in a harbour where people had every reason to expect trade, safety and normal life. Instead, they expected spices. They got a public health crisis with sales, and the rest of Europe, unknowingly, waits its turn. Once Messina is hit in October 1347, the Mediterranean stops behaving like a picturesque maritime highway and starts acting like the world's deadliest conveyor belt. One that moves not silk or spices or fine ceramics, but sickness. This is the moment when geography begins working against humanity. Ports that once symbolised prosperity now become points of vulnerability. Trade doesn't pause, ships don't stay anchored out of caution, and merchant schedules don't slow down simply because sailors are coughing up their lungs. Commerce continues, and with it, catastrophe. Imagine the Mediterranean not as a body of water but as a giant network map, each port a glowing node connected by sea routes that function like the veins and arteries of medieval trade. Goods move constantly. Wool from England, grain from Egypt, spices from the Levant, metals and wines from Iberia, fabrics from Italy. Every one of these routes depends on ships, and every ship is a cramped mobile container full of sailors, rats, fleas, and fabric bundles. An environment tailor-made for the bacteria we met earlier. As those plague-stricken ships flee Messina, they don't disappear into the sea. They head to other destinations desperate for refuge and trade. Some go north to Genoa, others head west toward Marseille, some sail toward North Africa. The important point is that every departure becomes a potential spark for a new outbreak. No medieval port operates in isolation. Each is a hub in a dense web of commerce, and once one hub goes dark, the others don't remain quiet for long. Late 1347 turns into early 1348, and the pattern becomes unmistakable. Wherever the fleeing Genoese ships dock, people begin to die, within weeks. Take the bustling port cities that lie west of Sicily. Marseille, one of the most significant gateways of Mediterranean commerce, receives the disease likely through maritime contact. Its tightly packed merchant quarters, cosmopolitan crowds, and constant flow of goods create the perfect environment for accelerated spread. From there, the plague can jump inland following major river routes. or climb along overland trade paths that connect rural villages to coastal grandeurs. Further north, Italian ports face their own onslaught. Genoa and Venice are economic powerhouses with enormous influence over Mediterranean trade. But that influence has a downside. The more connected you are, the more efficiently disease moves through your networks. Venice, with its vast merchant fleet, spreads goods to regions far beyond Italy, and the plague follows those same pathways. Genoa, with trading relationships stretching from the Black Sea to Spain, becomes another launching point for the disease's inland migration, and this is where the conveyor belt analogy shifts into overdrive. Ports feed cities, and cities feed the countryside. When coastal areas succumb, news travels inland along with carts of grain, barrels of wine, and merchant caravans. Urban centres are dependent on the hinterlands for survival, but in 1347 to 1348, the relationship becomes toxic. Traders bring home their wares, but they unintentionally bring home something else entirely. Think of movement patterns: grain shipments from ports to rural mills, wine transported to noble estates, cloth distributed to inland markets, salt carried to remote villages. In every one of these exchanges, people mingle, talk, cough, exchange coins, share tools, and breathe in each other's presence. That's all the plague needs. Meanwhile, merchant galleys don't only travel between major hubs, they also stop at small islands and fishing ports. These minor communities, which normally sit quietly outside the whirl of major trade politics, suddenly become stepping stones in a chain of death. Once the disease reaches an island settlement, it may lie low for a moment, but eventually locals sail to larger markets, or traders drop anchor for supplies. Not all priests travel for ecclesiastical duties. In short, the disease keeps moving because people keep moving. The Mediterranean becomes a vast relay system, not by intention, not by malice, but by the everyday rhythms of medieval life. Meanwhile, inland areas begin feeling the heat. Coastal towns might try to bar their gates, closing ports or banning incoming ships, but merchants inland still expect goods. Soldiers need supplies, farmers need tools, nobles need luxury items. Medieval economies don't shut down, they stumble forward even during crisis. So caravans continue to travel roads stretching from the coast into the heartlands, to Provence, to Tuscany, to Aragon, to the interior of the Balkans. Disease moves with them. In early 1348, the speed of spread shocks observers. Chroniclers describe villages where sickness seems to arrive through the mere arrival of travellers. They write of towns that fall silent within days, and communities that watch, horrified, as their markets turn from bustling squares into empty spaces patrolled only by stray animals and grave diggers. No one knows how the disease travels, so suspicion grows. The air, foreigners, merchants, sailors, the weather, divine wrath. What they do not suspect is the network of commerce that binds them all together. The tragedy is that the very thing that made the Mediterranean world prosperous, its connectivity, is exactly what makes it so vulnerable. In a region where goods can travel astonishing distances in short periods of time, death can travel even faster. By the time winter becomes spring in early 1348, the conveyor belt has done its work. The disease has seeded itself across the Mediterranean basin. It now has footholds in major cities and minor settlements alike. It has jumped from harbour to harbour, then from market to market, then from household to household. Europe's southern coastline is no longer the edge of the storm, it is the storm. This is the transitional moment in the story. In the months ahead, the plague will move deeper inland, following roads, rivers, pilgrim routes, and trading paths. But the reason it gets that opportunity, the reason Europe is about to face its worst demographic disaster, is what happened here in 1347 to 1348, when the Mediterranean transformed from an engine of wealth into an engine of contagion. Congratulations, your city is connected to the world. Unfortunately, the world is coughing. If most medieval cities met the plague with panic, less prayer, or the medieval equivalent of shrugging helplessly at the sky, Pistoia did something astonishingly modern. It wrote a rule book, a real one. with clauses, penalties, measurements, and enough bureaucratic flair to make you forget the entire population was staring down a catastrophe. The date is 11th of May 1348, and while the plague is ripping through much of Italy, Pistoia's city government gathers, not for celebration, not for commerce, not even for a religious procession, but for a legislative session. The citizens need help. The officials need to act. And so the city council does what city councils do best. They produce paperwork so detailed it could outlive them all. Even though the members have absolutely no idea what bacteria are or how disease truly spreads, they know one thing with startling clarity. Cities make disease worse. And if they don't regulate the movement of people, goods, animals and smells, yes, smells, they're doomed. Germs may be invisible, but stench is not, and medieval logic confidently assumes the two are at least cousins. The ordinances they draft are both deeply practical and unintentionally comedic. Practical because they reflect observation. People who handle rotting substances often get sick. Comedic because the lawmakers try to control chaos with the same tone a parent uses when telling a child not to eat dirt while the house is burning down. The document they produce on the 11th of May 1348 is one of the earliest, clearest examples of medieval public health policy written in real time, and it is beautifully anxious. Let's start with the most memorable rule: distance. Specifically, the insistence that certain activities, particularly those involving animal products that could smell, rot, or otherwise offend the nose, must occur far from other houses. One clause demands that rendering animal fat be performed at least 25 arm lengths away from neighbouring residences. No arm length conversion chart is provided, but we can imagine the lawmakers estimating it by eyeballing the nearest butcher and thinking, farther, farther. This immediately raises questions. Who measures the arm lengths? Do you pick the longest armed guy in the city to ensure maximum compliance? And how exactly does one enforce a rule that depends on medieval units of body-based measurement? The ordinance does not say. Well, what it does say is that anyone violating it will be fined 25 pence. A tidy sum for a community that usually prefers to resolve disputes with shouting and passive aggression. Then there are the rules about goods entering the city. Pistoia decides that not all items should cross its walls, especially if they come from plague-affected areas. Cloth in particular is viewed with suspicion, not because cloth carries fleas, no one knows fleas matter yet, but because cloth can retain odours, and if it smells funny, well, that must be dangerous. Officials attempt to build a sanitary border without knowing what sanitary means. They issue restrictions on vendors, on transporters, and even on funeral practices. One rule dictates precisely how the dead should be moved through the streets. Another outlines who may or may not enter the city based on where they've come from. It's the medieval precursor to a customs checkpoint, minus the uniforms and plus a lot more terror. The beauty of Pistoia's approach is that it reveals a surprisingly rational core hidden beneath medieval cosmology. They believe in miasma, bad air, foul odours, and assume plague travels by stench. They believe decay is dangerous, that spoiled meat is hazardous, that crowding increases risk. And while their reasoning is scientifically wrong, the conclusions aren't entirely misguided. Keep distance, regulate movement, control waste, monitor goods. In a world without microscopes, these are impressive leaps. But the ordinances also reveal something else: fear disguised as protocol. Every rule reflects a city council trying desperately to impose order on something fundamentally uncontrollable. You can practically hear the anxiety in each line. Keep that smelly activity far away. Don't bring suspicious goods inside the walls. Transport the dead carefully. Limit interactions with outsiders. These are not the words of confident administrators. They are the frantic strategies of leaders who understand that something bigger than them is at work, and yet there's brilliance in it. Pistoia's leaders don't freeze. They don't surrender themselves to fate. They act with the tools they have: measurement, law, fines, and the enduring municipal belief that if you write enough rules, the universe might eventually obey at least one. Even the fines themselves are revealing. 25 pence is no joke. It's significant enough to make citizens think twice. but not so outrageous as to be impossible to pay. A cynical observer might say the city is raising revenue off the apocalypse, but a kinder interpretation is that the council knows fear is more persuasive when paired with economic incentive. What's most striking is how early this document appears. 11 May 1348 is not years into the crisis. It's not even a late-stage response. This is the government reacting as the disaster unfolds, improvising regulations at a moment when the plague's nature remains utterly mysterious. For modern historians, the Pistoia ordinances serve as a rare, detailed snapshot of how medieval cities tried, earnestly, to manage a pandemic without understanding the enemy. It is the bureaucratic equivalent of swinging wildly in the dark while hoping to hit something helpful, and the meeting itself must have been a spectacle. Picture a group of civic leaders sitting around a wooden table, frantically debating the proper number of arm lengths required to keep rendered fat from killing the neighbourhood. Quills scratching, clerks sweating, everyone pretending they know what they're doing while the sound of funeral bells echoes outside. Truly, nothing says apocalypse like a city council meeting. But for all its comedy, the ordinance represents something profound. A society attempting with limited tools and overwhelming uncertainty to preserve itself. The rules may be flawed, the science non-existent, the strategies incomplete, but the effort is undeniably human. In the midst of fear, Pistoia chose governance. Order, policy, action. And that decision, however imperfect, becomes a template for how other medieval cities will try, often desperately, to survive what's coming next. Long before anyone had the faintest idea what a bacterium was, medieval lawmakers were already busy inventing something resembling public health, only without the health part, or frankly, the public part. What they did have was smell, and in a world where no one can see disease, no one can test for it, and no one can explain it, smell becomes the enemy. Which brings us to one of the most unintentionally iconic rules in the 11th of May, 1348 Pistoia Plague Ordinances, the decree that rendering animal fat must be done at least 25 arm lengths away from other houses, with a penalty of 25 pence for violators. To modern ears, this sounds like the opening line of a sketch comedy routine, but in 1348 it was deadly serious. Medieval people believed plague travelled through miasma, bad air, foul odours, vapours rising from decay. If it smelled rotten, it was considered dangerous. If it smelled very rotten, it was definitely killing someone. And if it smelled like your cousin's rendering workshop next door, well, that required legislation. But first, let's appreciate the brilliance of the measurement itself. 25 arm lengths. Not yards, not feet, not paces. Arm lengths. A unit of measurement so wonderfully imprecise it practically begs for creative interpretation. Whose arm length? The butcher's. Large. The tanner's? Larger. The town clerk's? Debatable. A random child dragged in from the street? Not recommended. The ordinance never specifies. Which means that medieval officials were essentially ordering, keep your stinky business far enough away that we can pretend not to smell it. And since plague was thought to flow on the breeze like an evil perfume, distance equalled safety, or at least the comforting illusion of safety. Rendering fat, melting animal tissue down into usable tallow, was an especially aromatic activity. Not a pleasant aroma either. Imagine boiling greasy scraps over an open flame until they transform into a thick, waxy substance. Now imagine doing this in a crowded city where streets double as waste channels, animals roam freely, and climate control is limited to hope it's windy. In such conditions, rendering fat near someone's home wasn't just rude, it was practically a death threat. Or so they believed. Hence, the rule, render fat greater than or equal to 25 arm lengths from neighbouring houses. Penalty, 25 pence. This was not pocket change. 25 pence could buy a lot of things in 1348. Food, tools, or several days of not rendering fat. The fine wasn't symbolic. It was designed to hurt. In a time of crisis, fear makes lawmakers bold, and bold lawmakers make expensive rules. But what's truly fascinating is what this ordinance represents. A city attempting rational management using irrational assumptions, They didn't understand bacteria, but they did understand patterns. They saw that certain activities, handling bodies, butchering animals, boiling fat, leaving refuse to rot, seemed associated with sickness. So they did what any terrified, slightly confused government would do. They tried to legislate the smell away. To them, odour was the signal, the thing they could detect, measure in their own creative way, and police. If good air meant health and bad air meant death, then the solution wasn't sanitation or quarantine or analysing transmission. It was simply getting far enough away from whatever stank. This might seem laughable now, but in its own distorted way, it mirrors principles of modern public health. Identify risks, things that make people sick, or appear to. Create distance, their version of social distancing but smell-based. Penalise non-compliance, still very modern. The problem wasn't the structure, it was the science, or lack thereof. While today we understand that rendering fat doesn't spread plague, the ordinance wasn't entirely misguided. In medieval cities, that activity often occurred near piles of animal waste, heaps of refuse, decomposing material, and surfaces that attracted vermin. So while the council was fighting imaginary vapours, they were accidentally pushing dangerous processes farther from dense residential areas. It wasn't germ theory, but it wasn't completely useless either, and for households living cheek by jowl with neighbours, such rules mattered. Imagine waking up every morning to the sound of your neighbour enthusiastically boiling down goat fat 3 feet from your door. In normal times, this would already be a nightmare. In plague time, it's a full-blown existential crisis. The ordinance doesn't just reflect health concerns, it reflects social tension. People wanted space, safety, and breathable air, and the government's response was essentially, okay, let's legislate a buffer zone, or grab a long-armed guy and start measuring. But the 25p fine is the best part. A rule is only as effective as the punishment attached, and nothing reveals civic anxiety like a high fee for the crime of doing smelly things too close to other people. If a resident ignored the rule, city officials could step in, scold them for endangering public welfare, and make them pay dearly for it. In a world collapsing under disease, bureaucracy somehow remained stubbornly alive. And this is the delightful paradox of medieval public health. While half the population was dying, the town hall was busy calculating penalties for proximity violations. It's as if modern governments responded to pandemics by saying, "We can't fix the virus, but we can fine you for annoying us." Yet beneath the humour lies something earnest. This ordinance is one of the clearest windows into how medieval people tried to control their environments when the cause of their suffering was invisible. They improvised, they argued, they drafted laws, they hoped rules would do what medicine could not. And even though the measurement was absurd and the science was wrong, the intention was not. Pistoia's leaders were grappling with fear in the only language they knew: distance, smell, and municipal authority. Still, the comedic heart of the rule endures. You can die horribly, but first you'll be fined for doing it too close to your neighbour. It's a perfect, tragic, bureaucratic snapshot of a city fighting the apocalypse one arm length at a time. By May 1348, the plague has already carved a brutal path through parts of Italy. But when it reaches Siena, something different happens. The earlier outbreaks elsewhere brought horror, yes, but what happens in Siena is collapse. Not a temporary stumble, not a momentary disruption, but a full civic unravelling. Structures that had held for generations, economic, social, religious, begin to buckle in the space of weeks. And through this devastation, we have one of the most haunting and human voices of the entire crisis, Agnolo di Tura, a man who witnesses the catastrophe firsthand and chooses to record it with an honesty that leaves little room for comfort. To understand what Siena faces, you have to picture a city at its peak. In the first half of the 14th century, Siena is wealthy, proud, ambitious. Its monumental cathedral is under construction, intended to be one of the greatest in Europe. Merchants thrive, art flourishes, the city walls rise proudly over the Tuscan hills, where Siena is not a backwater struggling for survival. It is an urban jewel, confident in its future. But confidence is fragile. In May 1348, plague bursts into the city with a speed that leaves no time for preparation. Siena had heard of outbreaks elsewhere, of course. News trickled in slowly, mixed with rumour and speculation. But the true scale of disaster is impossible to grasp until it is inside the city walls. Illness spreads through Siena like fire in dry grass. A household sees its first fever one day, and by the next several members are sick. Entire neighbourhoods begin to empty. Streets that once echoed with the calls of merchants and the rumble of carts grow eerily quiet. Priests struggle to administer last rites. Gravediggers cannot keep up. Even the wealthy, normally insulated from hardship, find themselves unable to buy safety. It is here that Agnolo di Tura, a modest Sienese citizen, begins his chronicle. His writing is not stylized or adorned. It is blunt, almost painfully so. Agnolo does not offer philosophical interpretations or theological reflections. He offers facts, and then he offers grief. He describes Siena in May 1348 as a city drowning in death. Food becomes scarce, not because the fields fail, but because so many people are sick or dead that there is no one left to harvest, transport, or sell supplies. Markets falter, work stops, construction halts. Daily life, woven so tightly, so confidently, begins to tear apart thread by thread. Agnolo observes, heartbreakingly, that the dead are sometimes left unburied because there are not enough living hands to carry them. This is not metaphor, this is direct observation. Now, corpses accumulate faster than they can be removed. Families, terrified, sometimes abandon the bodies of loved ones. Houses remain sealed, silent, still. And then comes the line that transforms Agnolo from a chronicler into a voice of the entire plague generation. And I, Agnolo di Tura, buried my 5 children with my own hands. It is one of the most devastating sentences in medieval literature, stark in its simplicity. It tells us everything we need to know about Siena in 1348. The collapse of burial systems, the overwhelming scale of loss, the isolation of grief, the way normal human rituals are torn away under the weight of catastrophe. Agnolo does not elaborate further. He leaves the weight of the statement to settle on the reader, as if even writing the sentence is almost too much to bear. While earlier cities had attempted some control through ordinances, rules, or improvised measures, Siena finds itself engulfed too quickly. The disease's advance is relentless, and fear becomes its own form of contagion. Those who remain healthy withdraw from society. Shops close, streets empty. Civic pride gives way to personal desperation. The impact is so profound that one of the city's most ambitious projects, the expansion of Siena's cathedral, grinds to a halt. Stones lie where they were placed. Scaffolding stands unfinished. Generations later, this incomplete expansion will become a symbol of the plague's interruption of civic dreams, a frozen monument to a future that never arrived. Agnolo's writing also tells us something else. The social fabric, once dense and resilient, frays under pressure. Neighbours avoid each other. Their family bonds strain. Acts of charity become rarer. In a society built on communal life, the plague forces isolation in ways the population is emotionally unprepared for. And yet, even in the midst of despair, Agnolo continues recording. His chronicle is not polished or poetic. It is raw testimony. It allows us to see Siena not through distant historical generalizations, but through the eyes of someone who lived it, someone who had to choose between witnessing and surviving, and somehow managed to do both. Siena's breakdown is not simply demographic. It is psychological, economic, spiritual. When countless dead line the streets and danger seems to float invisibly through the air, people stop trusting everything around them, their neighbours, their city officials, their priests, their own senses. And institutions falter because institutions are made of people, and people are running out of strength. By the time the worst passes, Siena is a changed place, emptier, poorer, traumatized, and Agnolo's words become a permanent reminder of that transformation. In a chapter filled with such darkness, Humour must be used delicately, almost as a shadow rather than a spotlight. Something faint, something exhausted, something that reflects the bleak absurdity of the time rather than mocking it. A humour that acknowledges survival rather than trivialising loss. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? The graveyard has a waiting list. It's the closest thing Siena had to optimism in May 1348. In the great sweep of history, individual voices often vanish, blurred by the weight of events, lost in the silence left behind. But in 1348, as Siena convulses under the violence of the plague, one man manages to leave behind a testimony so stark and so deeply human that it cuts straight through the centuries. His name is Agnolo di Tura, and he will become, unwillingly, one of the most unforgettable chroniclers of the Black Death. He is not a nobleman, not a scholar, not a priest. He writes not from safety or distance, but from the middle of the storm. His chronicle is not crafted like literature, it is carved out like a confession, and in it he leaves behind one of the most devastating lines ever written about the plague. And I buried my 5 children with my own hands. There is no metaphor in that sentence, no attempt at eloquence, no stylistic flourish. It is simply the truth. Written by a man whose world had collapsed so completely that burying his children had become not only his grief, but his duty. What makes Agnolo's account powerful is not only what he saw, but what those sights did to him, and to Siena. The city that once thrived on community and collaboration becomes, in the plague months, a place where survival is not shared. It is solitary, brutally solitary. Before the plague, Siena is a city where neighbours lean out of windows to exchange gossip, where family networks stretch across districts, where work, worship and celebration fill the streets. A city built on togetherness. But the plague dismantles that structure with terrifying speed. For Agnolo, this unravelling is not philosophical, it is personal. In his writing, he describes something that medieval people rarely put into words: the collapse of social bonds under pressure. Friends stop helping friends, families fracture, neighbours avoid each other even in moments of deepest need. Not because people become cruel, but because fear pulls everyone inward, sealing households into tiny pockets of desperation. Where once a sick neighbour might have received a helping hand, now the door stays shut. Where once the dead would be carried with dignity to burial, now they lie untouched until someone can gather the strength or the desperation to move them. For Agnolo, this isolation is not theoretical. It is the condition in which he is forced to bury his children alone. To bury a single child is already an unfathomable grief. To bury 5, one after another, with no community support, no comforting rituals, and no priestly presence, no shared mourning, is something almost impossible to comprehend. And yet Agnolo records it in a single sentence, as if the weight of it is too much to put into more words. But the sentence does more than convey personal tragedy. It illuminates a larger truth about the plague. The crisis destroys not only bodies but the social fabric itself. In normal times, Siena's burial system is a structured and sacred component of civic life. Funerals are community events, mourning rituals are shared, and burial grounds attended with care. But in 1348, as deaths multiply beyond anything the city has ever imagined, all of these systems break. Gravediggers fall ill. Priests cannot reach every household. Cemeteries overflow. Funeral rites are shortened or abandoned entirely. The communal act of mourning becomes yet another casualty. And so, in the vacuum left behind, individuals like Agnolo are forced to take on roles no parent should ever have to carry. His account also reveals something insidious, the emotional numbness that takes over when grief becomes too constant. Chroniclers in many cities mention a similar feeling, that after the first wave of horror, people begin to lose their ability to react at all. Death becomes expected, loss becomes routine, tears dry before they have time to fall. Agnolo's brief, blunt statement reflects this numbness. It is not coldness, it is exhaustion. It is trauma so deep that language shrinks before it. But even so, his writing does something extraordinary. It restores the humanity to a disaster often described only in statistics and sweeping narratives. It forces us to see the Black Death not only as a historical event, but as a collection of individual heartbreaks, each one altering the course of a life. Agnolo becomes our anchor because he speaks where others, overcome by despair or too consumed by survival, fall silent. His testimony tells us what the plague does not just to cities but to souls. He shows us how isolation replaces community, how duty replaces ritual, how human resilience becomes both a curse and a miracle, how survival, when everything collapses, becomes a lonely act. And in reading his words, we understand something essential about the medieval experience of plague. People did not merely face death, they faced death alone, in a world that had lost the capacity to hold them together. There is no humour to soften this chapter, no lightness to cut through the darkness. Sometimes the truth must be allowed to sit heavy, unadorned. Agnolo's sentence is the entire tone, and I buried my 5 children with my own hands. It is the voice of a man who lived through the end of his world and chose to write, not to comfort himself, but to ensure that someone, someday, would understand what it cost to survive. There are moments in history when society does not simply bend under the weight of catastrophe. It breaks, suddenly and completely, leaving even the most sacred traditions scattered like splinters. In 1348, one of the first pillars to collapse under the force of the plague is the thing medieval communities rely on almost as much as food or shelter: ritual. And among rituals, none is more deeply embedded, more emotionally loaded, or more universally respected than the act of burying the dead. Funerals in ordinary times are carefully choreographed affairs. Families gather, clergy preside, bells toll, bodies are washed and shrouded, prayers are spoken. Burial grounds are places of respect and continuity. You can walk through one and read the history of your community carved into stone and soil. Ritual provides connection to the living, to the dead, to faith, to identity. But rituals depend on predictability. They depend on time, labour, space, and structure. And in 1348, death stops playing by the rules. Plague kills too many, too quickly, too relentlessly. No system built for normal life, no matter how pious, how organised, or how emotionally rooted, can withstand the tidal wave of bodies that begins to rise. Chroniclers describe scenes that would feel unbelievable if they did not appear repeatedly across different regions. They speak of bodies accumulating in homes, simply because no one is left to carry them out. They describe the dying lying next to the dead because there is no one healthy enough, or brave enough, to separate them. They note how the familiar sound of funeral bells becomes so constant that it ceases to have meaning. It is not that people suddenly stop caring about their dead, it's that caring becomes physically impossible. Gravediggers, stretched far beyond capacity, begin to succumb themselves. Priests tasked with performing burial rites can't keep pace with the number of deaths, and increasingly fear entering infected homes. Coffin makers cannot fashion enough wood. Horses cannot haul enough carts. Even those willing to help often find there is no one left to assist them. The result is something medieval society is unprepared for: mass graves. Not orderly ones either. Not the planned, consecrated communal sites of later centuries. These are deep trenches hastily dug wherever there is space: fields, outskirts, unused plots of land. Chroniclers record bodies being laid in rows, layered atop one another as the grave fills too rapidly to cover each individually. Earth is shoveled over them quickly, sometimes not enough to fully hide the shape of limbs. Workers, overwhelmed, move with numb determination. There is no time to recite the proper prayers for each soul. There is no time to do anything but make room for the next arrival. Even worse are the shallow burials, a grim symptom of exhaustion and fear. In some accounts, families place the dead outside homes or at the edge of roads with a thin layer of soil covering them, not because they are careless, but because they are overwhelmed. The burial is as much a plea for help as it is an act of closure. and in these hastily covered graves the natural world begins to intrude. Chroniclers, writing with a mix of shock and revulsion, describe animals scavenging these sites. Dogs, attracted by scent. Pigs, rooting instinctively. Birds, circling overhead. Medieval people, already terrified by disease, now face a new horror. The sight of nature reclaiming the dead before humans can. It is not simply disturbing. It feels apocalyptic, a sign that the boundary between civilization and chaos has dissolved. Under these conditions, traditional funeral systems don't just strain, they collapse. Our clergy are forced to abbreviate rites or abandon them entirely. Cemeteries overflow, and digging new ones becomes physically impossible at the required pace. Families accustomed to mourning with structure find themselves grieving in improvised, lonely, fragmented ways. Ritual, once a communal anchor, becomes a faint echo of itself, drowned out by the sheer scale of death. Survival, in this setting, has nothing to do with honour or dignity. It becomes logistical, mechanical, repetitive. People no longer plan funerals, they manage bodies, and they do it with a kind of emotional shock that leaves them numb to the very tragedy they are confronting. Communities that once prided themselves on reverence must accept the unthinkable. The dead must be moved quickly, quietly, and without ceremony, because there are too many, and the living are too few. In the process, the social fabric tears. Ritual is more than routine. It is a symbol of who people are, what they believe, and how they face mortality. When it disappears, people lose one of their last psychological defences. Grief becomes solitary. Mourning becomes fragmented. Faith becomes strained. And yet people continue, not because they feel strong, but because there is no alternative. The earth must open for the dead, whether or not rituals accompany them. Bodies must be removed, whether or not prayers follow. Life, shrinking and battered, must continue its march forward, if only by inches. This chapter of the plague story is not dramatic in the sense of battles or political decrees. It is dramatic because it exposes the limits of human endurance. It shows what happens when the ancient and sacred rituals people trust are swallowed whole by the unstoppable rhythm of mortality. And as dark as these chronicles are, they also preserve a brutal truth, that for many in 1348, death was no longer an event, it was a system overload. As one might summarise with grim understatement, in normal times you plan a funeral. In 1348 you planned a pile, and that is the clearest sign of a society at its breaking point. By the time the plague reaches London in 1348, the city is already a crowded, noisy, churningly alive metropolis. Exactly the kind of place a fast-moving epidemic finds irresistibly convenient. Narrow lanes, timbered houses leaning inward, marketplaces teeming with bodies and breath, ships crowding into the Thames with cargo and crews. It is a perfect crucible. And once the disease begins its sweep, where London does what any medieval city would do when death arrives faster than its systems can keep up. It starts digging. But not just anywhere. It creates a new neighbourhood. Not a pretty one, not a bustling one, not one with bakeries, guild halls, or any hope of resale value. A cemetery, large, organised, and chillingly purposeful. Known today as East Smithfield, this burial ground becomes London's emergency response to an emergency that refuses to slow down. The site is established specifically for the plague dead, and it sees its heaviest use during the peak years 1348 to 1350, a period later confirmed by bioarchaeological sampling that examined victims from this very ground. Here, thousands of bodies find their final resting place, dug and placed with grim efficiency. What makes East Smithfield so distinctive isn't simply the number of burials, though thousands is staggering, but the intentional planning behind it. Unlike the chaotic mass graves described in parts of continental Europe, London's civic and royal authorities act early enough to designate land, arrange labour, and ensure that at least some structure exists. Chaos still reigns, but it's organised chaos. Picture the scene. carters hauling the dead from parishes overwhelmed by fatalities, diggers working from dawn to dusk, shovels biting into fresh soil, workers laying bodies in rows covered quickly as more arrive, clerics murmuring brief blessings, racing time itself. The city has no illusions. It knows the usual burial grounds cannot handle what is coming. Churchyards are small, overcrowded, and hemmed in by streets and buildings. If London does not expand its burial capacity, bodies will accumulate where people live, heightening panic and possibly disease. So East Smithfield is created outside the usual parochial boundaries, a new quarter of the dead because the quarters of the living cannot absorb them. Londoners, who are accustomed to thinking of their city in terms of wards and markets, suddenly have to reckon with this new addition. It lies outside the bustling centre, but close enough to remind everyone daily. The city is burying more people than it can count, and still, carts keep coming. The workers tasked with managing the cemetery face the plague's relentlessness firsthand. Burial trenches are laid out in straight lines, practical, efficient, unemotional. Rows fill quickly, new rows open. The ground becomes a constantly shifting canvas of earth, sweat, man's sorrow. The ordinary rituals of burial, processions, family gatherings, individual prayers are replaced by simple necessity. Get the dead underground before the next wave arrives. The emotional cost of this system is impossible to quantify. To lose a loved one is devastating. To see them carried to a communal trench alongside strangers, placed among hundreds, without the rites that normally mark a life's end, this compounds the grief. Yet Londoners endure it because there is no other option. Survival now means accepting the unthinkable as normal. Over time, East Smithfield becomes a grim indicator of the plague's progress. In 1348, the trenches begin filling. By 1349, the pace accelerates brutally. Contemporary accounts record streets emptier than usual, households shuttered, businesses closed. Death tolls soar. By 1350, the worst passes and burials finally slow, leaving the ground thick with the memories of those horrific months. Centuries later, when archaeologists uncover 337 skeletons from the site for scientific study, the remains reveal more than the plague's brutality. They confirm the time frame of the cemetery's use, exactly 1348 to 1350, placing the victims squarely within the peak of London's plague crisis. They also show something Londoners could never have known: traces of the bacteria embedded in the bones, evidence of the disease that transformed the city. But in 1348, London has no means of identifying such microscopic enemies. What London does have is infrastructure, imperfect but decisive, and it uses that infrastructure to confront a crisis larger than anything the city has seen. East Smithfield becomes not just a cemetery but a survival mechanism. Without it, bodies would have piled up in homes, alleys and churchyards, overwhelming neighbourhoods already paralysed by fear. The cemetery absorbs the shock of mass mortality, helping the city maintain at least the illusion of structure when everything around seems to crumble. Surviving this chapter of London's history means understanding a terrifying truth. When death moves faster than ritual, the city must adapt or drown. And London adapts with a kind of grim administrative determination, building a new district dedicated entirely to death, because that is what survival now requires. It is hard to imagine how Londoners felt walking past this ground, knowing that so many friends, neighbours and strangers lay beneath, and knowing also that tomorrow might bring more. The cemetery is a silent presence, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the speed of the plague. In a way, East Smithfield becomes the city's ledger of loss, thousands of entries, all final, none voluntary. And for all its grim necessity, the place acquires a kind of dark humour in retrospect. When you designate land for thousands of corpses and build trenches like house foundations, it's impossible not to reflect on what it resembles. The city invented a new neighbourhood, plague cemetery estates, no amenities. But beneath that bitter humour lies something profound, evidence of a city responding to disaster not with surrender but with action. For London, digging becomes an act of resilience, an act of defiance, an act of survival. Because if the plague demands space, London will carve it. If the plague demands ground, London will offer it. And if the plague threatens to bury the city, London will bury the dead first. To understand the plague, it isn't enough to read chronicles or picture terrified citizens hurrying through narrow streets. Sometimes you have to look at the ground, because the ground keeps better records than any medieval clerk ever could. And nowhere does the soil speak more loudly than in East Smithfield, the emergency burial ground created just outside London during the worst of the outbreak. While other cities were improvising trenches and piling bodies wherever panic allowed, London designated a specific site, dug deep, and began filling it at a pace that defies belief. How many people were buried there? The commonly cited archaeological estimate places the number at around 2,400 individuals, 2,400 lives, 2,400 stories, 2,400 reminders that the plague was not an abstraction, it was an arithmetic. But raw totals only hint at the scale. What brings the horror into focus is the rate. Some historical summaries report that at the peak of London's crisis, as many as approximately 200 people were buried per day in East Smithfield. This number, important to note as reported, not a perfect census, is staggering. 200 burials in a single day is more than a tragedy. It's an industrial process forced upon a city that never wanted one. Imagine being a burial worker in late 1349. Your morning begins not with prayer or breakfast, but with a long line of carts carrying the dead. Your midday meal, if you manage one, is eaten standing in a trench. Your evening ends with the knowledge that tomorrow will bring another wave. And the day after that, and the day after that. When your daily schedule includes bury 200 people, you stop pretending this is a normal year. And yet these numbers, 2,400 in total, approximately 200 in a day, aren't just statistics. They help us reconstruct the shape of London's suffering. The 2,400 burials, a city's silent archive. While most medieval burial grounds contain bodies from decades or even centuries of use, East Smithfield is different. Nearly everyone buried there died within a concentrated window from 1348 to 1350. This makes the cemetery a time capsule, an unusually precise one. Later scientific work examining 337 skeletons from the site allowed researchers to confirm not only the time frame but the disease itself, identifying Yersinia pestis in dental remains. But the numbers under the soil tell an even broader story. They show us a period in which death did not simply increase, it accelerated, hit a peak, then slowly receded as the wave passed. The grave layout itself, rows, trenches, systematic placement, reveals that London was forced to adapt quickly. This was not a casual expansion of a churchyard. It was a logistic solution to an existential threat. The 200 per day shock point. While the 2,400 total conveys the enormity of loss, the reported approximately 200 per day rate gives us something emotionally sharper, a glimpse into the unbearable tempo of burial work. Parenthesis. Again, this figure appears in summaries of the site and must be understood as a reported peak, not a confirmed daily tally. But even as a reported number, it aligns with the overwhelming conditions documented across London's parishes. If you think about it practically, 200 burials per day requires dozens of labourers, constant digging, continuous transport of bodies, coordinated placement in trenches, minimal ritual, relentless endurance. This is not a sustainable system. It is a system running at the edge of collapse. And yet, miraculously, it did not collapse completely. The very fact that East Smithfield exists and operated long enough to hold thousands shows that London, even in extremis, maintained a kind of grim order. Why these numbers matter. It is tempting to view plague history as a blur of panic, prayer, and death. But without numerical anchors, the event becomes shapeless. The figures from East Smithfield prevent that. 2,400 burials show us scale. Around 200 per day shows us velocity. Scale tells us how many. Velocity tells us how fast. Together they tell us how a society breaks. These numbers force us to confront what the city faced. Not ordinary mortality, not steady attrition, but a surge so fierce it swallowed entire neighbourhoods before people could comprehend what was happening. The cemetery becomes a graph drawn in soil, one that medieval people could not chart but lived inside. What it felt like for Londoners' numbers don't capture the fear of walking past the burial ground and seeing fresh earth turn daily. They don't capture the shock of realising that the people you saw last week, merchants, apprentices, children, now lie in neat rows underground. They don't capture the exhaustion of workers who dig until their hands blister, then dig again. They don't capture the way everyday routines disappear when confronted with the need to bury hundreds. And they certainly don't capture the numbness that creeps into the city, a numbness that allows people to continue functioning even as the world collapses around them. But they hint at these things, and that is enough to reconstruct the emotional landscape of a city drowning in death, yet determined to keep going. The numbers under the soil, as memory centuries later, long after the crisis, East Smithfield becomes a place of study. Archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians descend on the site not merely to tally deaths, but to understand how a society responds when its daily reality becomes unmanageable. The numbers they uncover are not just evidence, they are witnesses. They remind us that every trench held dozens of individuals. Every burial represented a story cut short. Every day at peak meant 200 heartbreaks. London survived, but the cost is recorded silently underground, waiting for those who are willing to measure, accurately, respectfully, painfully, what it truly meant. And in that spirit of dark, grounded honesty, the chapter's humour lands with a grim smile rather than a laugh. When your daily schedule includes bury 200 people, you stop pretending this is a normal year. In plague-stricken London, the abnormal became the only reality there was. For centuries after the Black Death, historians, theologians, physicians, poets, and even the occasional enthusiastic bystander offered explanations for what happened in the mid-14th century. Some blamed the planets, some blamed the weather, some blamed sinners, some blamed strangers, and some blamed the kind of air that smelled like it had given up on life. Medieval people were never short on theories, but they were consistently short on accuracy. Then came modern science, and modern science, ever the polite but devastating guest at the dinner party, looked at 700 years of speculation, cleared its throat and said, "Let's ask the skeletons." The most revealing of these interviews came from a rigorously studied sample of 337 individuals excavated from the emergency plague cemetery at East Smithfield. These are not random medieval remains. They are victims from a tightly concentrated window, 1348 to 1350, the peak of the plague in London, preserved in the kind of contextual clarity archaeologists dream about and historians write best-selling books about. These 337 skeletons became the key to transforming plague history from educated guesswork into biological reality. What bioarchaeology can see that medieval chroniclers couldn't. Chroniclers recorded fear, symptoms, social collapse, and personal loss. Essential information, but filtered through emotion, superstition, and incomplete understanding. Bioarchaeology, however, reads a different language. Bone density, enamel stress markers, microbial DNA, chemical signatures, and skeletal wear. Together, these threads reveal patterns medieval observers could never articulate. For example, the study of the 337 skeletons revealed Yersinia pestis DNA preserved in dental pulp, providing direct molecular evidence of the disease, indicators of previous nutritional stress, showing that some plague victims had already lived difficult, then physically demanding lives before the outbreak, age distribution that challenges the idea that the plague selectively targeted only certain groups, comparative mortality profiles indicating the epidemic struck across social lines, not sparing those presumed stronger or healthier. This is not storytelling. This is data. And data, for all its lack of poetry, often tells the truth more ruthlessly than any chronicle. Where a medieval writer might say, The weak died first, the skeletons counter with, "Actually, strength didn't save anyone." Where medieval theorists insisted plague targeted sinners, the bones reply, "No moral sorting detected, everyone was eligible." Where observers describe the physical horrors of the disease, science confirms, yes, the bacterium is present, yes, it was fast, yes, it was everywhere. Medieval people had theories. The skeletons brought receipts. Why the number 337 matters. The 337 individuals in the study are not a random accident of excavation. They are part of one of the most scientifically valuable plague assemblages in the world. Here's why. 1. The cemetery was used only during the Black Death. This means researchers can be certain the individuals died during the early pandemic, not decades earlier or later. 2. The site was excavated systematically. Layers, orientations, and burial patterns are meticulously recorded, allowing scientists to reconstruct how the dead were interred during the crisis. 3. The burials represent ordinary Londoners. These were not elites receiving special funerals. They were the population at large, giving us a rare cross-section of a medieval city's demographic. 4. The DNA is unusually well preserved. Teeth, especially molars, protect biological material in ways soft tissue never could. Put simply, the 337 skeletons form a data set so precise and contextually secure that it allows researchers to test hypotheses about the Black Death rather than merely speculate. The questions these skeletons help answer. Who died in the plague? Not just the weak, not just the old, not just the poor. Bioarchaeology reveals a wide age range, including healthy adults in their prime. Did social status matter? In normal times, skeletal wear reflects labour and class, but in 1348 to 1350, death is democratic. Labourers, merchants, artisans, many lie side by side. How fast did the disease move? The absence of skeletal lesions consistent with long-term illness suggests deaths occurred too quickly for chronic conditions to form. This matches documentary descriptions of extremely rapid decline. Did individuals show signs of resilience? Some skeletons show enamel defects from childhood famine or illness. These markers help researchers understand how early life stress influenced plague susceptibility, but crucially, many otherwise healthy individuals still succumbed. This reinforces the plague's sheer indiscriminate force. Which strain of Y. pestis was present? DNA analysis links the London victims to the same bacterial lineage found across Europe during the first great pandemic wave. This helps build a continental timeline for the pathogen's spread. What the bones cannot tell us. Even with all these insights, skeletons remain silent on certain aspects. They cannot describe fear. They cannot recount the suffocating panic of watching neighbours die. They cannot convey the psychological collapse of a city. They cannot tell us how individuals coped, prayed, despaired, or hoped. But they don't need to. Chronicle writers like Agnolo di Tura provide the emotional narrative, the bones provide the biological evidence. Together they create a fuller, sharper picture than either source alone. Why this matters for understanding survival. For centuries, interpretations of the plague were shaped by theology, rumour and guesswork. Modern bioarchaeology replaces conjecture with proof. The 337 skeletons show that. The plague was fast, catastrophically fast. The plague was widespread, across ages and social classes. The plague was bacterial, not supernatural. The plague's impact was not selective, but overwhelming. In some ways, this makes the event even more terrifying. In others, it finally gives medieval victims the dignity of being understood. The final word across 700 years, countless explanations have been proposed for the Black Death, but only in the last few decades have we begun to ground those explanations in biological fact rather than myth. And it all started with a sample of 337 skeletons, 337 witnesses, 337 voices that speak without words. Or, as someone looking back might summarise, half in awe, half in grim amusement. Medieval people had theories. The skeletons brought receipts. For more than 6 centuries, the Black Death existed in a strange space between certainty and speculation. Medieval chroniclers described the symptoms vividly. Archaeologists unearthed mass graves. Historians traced trade routes and mortality patterns. But a lingering question hovered over all of it. Was Yersinia pestis really the organism responsible for the pandemic that reshaped Eurasia in the 14th century? The symptoms matched bubonic plague. The timelines matched. The mortality scale matched. But skeptics persisted. Some proposed anthrax. Others suggested a hemorrhagic fever. Still others argued for an unknown viral agent. Because without biological evidence, the conversation remained a very academic form of ghost hunting. Hunting a microscopic killer that left no soft tissue behind. Then came 2011, when modern science decided it was tired of speculation. A team of researchers analysed ancient DNA from individuals buried in the plague cemetery at East Smithfield, cross-referencing genomic fragments with modern bacterial lineages. Their findings were published in Nature, and for the first time in history, the Black Death spoke with genetic clarity. Yes, it was Yersinia pestis. The medieval catastrophe had a microbial fingerprint, and modern scientists finally had the technology to lift it. How do you get DNA from a 14th century skeleton? The process is delicate, almost surgical. Researchers drilled into the teeth of plague victims, specifically targeting the dental pulp, one of the most protected cavities in the human body. If any trace of Y. pestis survived the centuries, it would be there. Ancient DNA is fragile. It fractures, degrades, and rarely preserves long sequences. Recovering usable genetic material from centuries-old remains is like trying to reconstruct a book from singed fragments discovered in a fireplace. But teeth, with their dense structure, can shelter fragments of biological truth long after flesh and clothing have vanished. Using cutting-edge sequencing methods, scientists extracted, amplified, and reconstructed the genome of the bacterium that killed Londoners in 1348 to 1350. What emerged was astonishing. The pathogen was unequivocally Yersinia pestis. It belonged to an ancestral branch predating several modern plague strains. Its genome helped explain how later outbreaks emerged in waves. In short, the bones confirmed what history suspected but could never prove. Why this matters more than you'd think. Before 2011, skeptics argued that medieval descriptions were too dramatic, too fast-moving, or too inconsistent to match known bubonic plague strains. Some suggested the Black Death must have been something entirely different, perhaps transmitted through air alone, or all caused by a hemorrhagic virus. The Nature study effectively ended these debates. It provided direct molecular evidence, not inference, a complete genome, not scattered fragments, an anchor point for tracing plague evolution backward and forward through time. Suddenly, the Black Death was no longer just a historical tragedy. It was a biological event with a clear, traceable lineage. The same bacterium that ravaged medieval Europe still exists in the world today, in rodent reservoirs from Central Asia to the American Southwest. But its ancient form, the one reconstructed in 2011, represented the Big Bang moment for later plague epidemics. The Black Death was not an isolated eruption. It was the ancestor of centuries of outbreaks. Medieval people had fear. Modern scientists had precision. The chasm between medieval and modern interpretations is enormous. A Londoner in 1349 might have believed the planets aligned badly. The air had become poisoned. God was angry. A strange wind brought death. Cats, dogs, or strangers carried contagion. But in 2011, with technology far beyond the imagination of medieval physicians, researchers were able to say with authority, here is the bacterium, here is its genome, here is its lineage, here is how it spread, here is how it changed, here is how it still exists today. The uncertainties of the 14th century became certainties of the 21st, a bridge across 662 years. The symbolic weight of this study is immense. It means that the people buried in East Smithfield, ordinary Londoners who died in fear and confusion, continued contributing to human knowledge long after their world ended. Their bones did not just lie in silence. They answered questions. They corrected assumptions. They built a scientific bridge between the medieval past and the genomic present. And perhaps most poignantly, they finally identified the killer that took their lives. Imagine being a plague victim in 1349, thinking your final contribution to the world was simply becoming another statistic in a catastrophic year. Then imagine your remains being excavated in the 1980s, studied in the 2000s, and ultimately helping scientists publish a landmark genetic reconstruction in 2011. That is a legacy. A strange one. A profound one. And, if you have a dark sense of humour, a slightly absurd one. Imagine dying in 1349 and still contributing to a paper in 2011. That's commitment. What this means for understanding survival. With the genome confirmed, researchers now understand why the disease spread so rapidly, why mortality rates were so high, how later plague waves evolved, how rodent populations and flea vectors contributed, why certain areas suffered more than others. None of this knowledge could help the people of 1348 to 1350, but it helps us understand the event with clarity they never had. It also reminds us that survival is not just physical, it is historical. The victims did not survive the plague, but their DNA, preserved in enamel and published centuries later, ensures that their story did. In the end, the nature study is not merely about confirming a microbe. It is about giving names to the shadows of history. It is about transforming tragedy into knowledge. It is about listening to a voice that took 700 years to speak. And it spoke through 337 skeletons, and through the scientists who finally learned how to listen. Before microscopes, before germ theory, before anyone had the faintest idea that a flea could be anything other than a personal inconvenience or a bedtime nuisance. Medieval people built their understanding of disease around the sense that betrayed them least: smell. In a world without scientific instruments, what you could see, hear, taste, touch, or, most importantly, smell, shaped your theory of survival. And unfortunately for 14th century Europe, the nose was not the tool best suited for identifying Yersinia pestis. It was, however, the tool best suited for identifying medieval cities, which often smelled like a competition to see how many unpleasant scents could occupy the same street. So when plague arrived, people blamed what their senses already distrusted: bad air, known then as miasma. And to be fair, miasma theory wasn't senseless ignorance. It was, in many ways, a clever system built from the observations available to them. It was wrong, yes, but rational within the framework of their world. Why bad air seemed like the obvious culprit. Imagine walking through a medieval town before the plague hits. You step into a narrow alley, unlit, damp, barely wide enough for two people to pass. On one side, a tanner dumps residue from animal hides. On the other, a butcher's runoff mingles with household waste. Overhead, chamber pots are emptied with little warning. The air hangs heavy with rot, smoke, sweat, refuse, and occasionally something unidentifiable that makes you question all of your life choices. It is not hard to see why medieval people thought disease floated on the breeze like a malicious perfume. They associated sickness with places that smelled terrible, because places that smelled terrible usually were dangerous, full of filth, animals, garbage, stagnant water, and yes, flea-bearing rats. Miasma theory was built on several practical observations. Sickness clustered in foul-smelling areas. Dumping grounds, slaughter zones, and muddy alleys saw more disease than breezy hilltops. Rot produced odours, and rot often accompanied illness. Corpses, sewage, and decaying waste all generated powerful stenches. Fresh air seemed to help. Rural areas, though never safe, sometimes had lower mortality, reinforcing the belief that clean air could protect you. People sensed danger before they saw symptoms. You often smelled something was wrong long before you could identify it. In short, bad air felt like the only thing connecting the dots, and when something is invisible, untouchable and devastating, Humans cling to the evidence they do have. In 1348, that evidence was the nose. Intelligent people using the wrong toolbox. It's easy, centuries later, to laugh at miasma theory, but doing so ignores the intellectual seriousness of medieval medical thought. The people of the 14th century were not ignorant. They were operating without access to the tools needed to make correct conclusions. Imagine assembling a puzzle with only half the pieces, and discovering the missing ones belong to microbiology, entomology, and immunology. In that world, miasma theory had several strengths. It explained patterns, even though the explanation was incorrect. It encouraged avoidance of filth, which indirectly helped public health. It offered actionable advice such as burning incense, air circulation, or leaving foul neighbourhoods. It aligned with sensory experience, something deeply trusted. Doctors and scholars of the age were not dismissing evidence. They were interpreting it through the only frameworks available: classical teachings, humoral theory, environmental observation, and the simple reality that areas with bad smells often correlated with disease outbreaks. They saw correlation and assumed causation. And who could blame them? After all, nobody could see a flea the size of a sesame seed carry bacteria invisible to the naked eye, jump onto a rat, travel across a ship, bite a human, and trigger the deadliest pandemic in European history. But everybody could see and smell a filthy alley. And trust me, they didn't know about bacteria, but they absolutely knew that alleyway was a crime. How miasma shaped survival behaviours. People adapted their behaviour based on what they believed was killing them. Incense, herbs, perfumes, and smoke citizens carried packets of herbs, flowers, or spices, anything aromatic to cleanse the air around them. Physicians wore beaked masks stuffed with fragrances to filter corrupted air. Households burned strong-smelling substances like juniper, rosemary, pine resin, or even animal products to chase away invisible vapours. Avoiding bad-smelling districts, rather than avoiding rats, which were impossible to eliminate, people avoided butcher areas, dumps, riverside marshes, and crowded market stalls. They moved away from what smelled dangerous, a choice that sometimes helped, but often did not. Quarantine, but the scented version. While quarantine rules later became more structured, early versions were frequently tied to odour. A house that smelled wrong could be inspected or cordoned off. Urban regulations about smell cities passed laws restricting animal slaughter inside walls, controlling waste disposal, and limiting certain trades near homes, not because they understood infection, but because they understood stench. These behaviours were misguided in mechanism but not useless in outcome. Anything that reduced filth inadvertently reduced flea habitat, and anything that reduced crowding inadvertently reduced person-to-person transmission of pneumonic plague. It wasn't correct science, but it was practical improvisation. The fleas they never suspected today. We know how plague travelled. Fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, fleas carried by black rats, rats transported through trade routes, fleas jumping to humans when rats died. But why didn't medieval people blame fleas? Because fleas were common, not extraordinary tiny, not dramatic ordinary pests, not agents of apocalypse invisible in the causal chain, even if ubiquitous. You don't panic about something that's always been there. You panic about the alleyway that assaults your senses like a biological insult. Miasma, theory, wrong cause, right instinct. Though incorrect, miasma theory led to cleaner streets, eventually, more attention to urban sanitation, early forms of public health policy efforts to distance oneself from crowded areas, experiments with ventilation. It's paradoxical. The theory was wrong. But the behavioural changes it inspired sometimes saved lives anyway. Survival, in this chapter of plague history, is less about correct knowledge and more about practical adaptation based on the information available. Medieval people weren't foolish. They were navigating a deadly mystery using the only compass they had, their senses. And that compass pointed directly at the nearest foul-smelling street, prompting the medieval equivalent of, "Nope, absolutely not. We're going the other way." They feared the wrong culprit, but they feared it with understandable precision. because in a world where death floats invisibly, you cling to what you can smell. Modern readers sometimes imagine that surviving the Black Death was simply a matter of getting out, picking up your things, gathering your family, and bolting for the countryside before the plague noticed you were missing. In 1348, however, just leave the city was about as realistic as just become a bird and fly away. Medieval movement was not free, not simple, and absolutely not welcome once fear took hold. Cities, towns, and villages, already anxious, already unsure of what caused plague, looked at travellers with the same enthusiasm you'd reserve for someone coughing directly into a pot of soup you were about to eat. People did try to flee, but the landscape they fled into was no longer a network of friendly, interconnected communities. It was a patchwork of terrified local governments, each armed with hastily written ordinances and an unwavering belief that the safest place for any outsider was somewhere else. The logic behind restricting movement. By 1348 to 1349, many Italian towns had adopted the same governance style seen earlier in Pistoia. Strict control of goods and bodies. These rules were based on the logic of miasma and contagion by contact. Not correct, scientifically speaking, but internally consistent for the time. Authorities believed scents carried sickness, goods absorbed infection. People from plague zones brought contaminated air with them. Fresh arrivals were unpredictable and therefore dangerous. When you combine fear with municipal authority, you get ordinances that read like polite panic. No one may enter from infected areas. No one may bring cloth, clothing, or other suspect materials. No transporting corpses across jurisdiction lines. Merchants from contaminated regions must be refused at the gates. Travellers must declare where they have slept, what they have touched, and how recently they have lost family members. This wasn't paranoia for its own sake. It was an attempt at civic self-preservation. Towns weren't trying to be cruel. They were trying not to die. That meant controlling the movement of people and controlling the movement of goods, especially items that could carry odours or decay, which medieval logic interpreted as plague's closest companions. Why just leaving was practically impossible one. Town gates functioned like border checkpoints. When plague panic hit, gates didn't just guard against enemies, they guarded against everyone. They could be locked, closed at odd hours, or selectively opened only for locals returning from nearby fields. Imagine arriving at a town after a long, desperate flight, exhausted and hopeful, only to be told, absolutely not. Please die locally. This sentiment wasn't written in official documents, but it was certainly implied by the guards' behaviour. 2. Outsiders became walking red flags. If you were a stranger, you were assumed suspicious. If you were from a plague-hit city, you were practically radioactive. Some towns required letters proving you came from an uninfected region. Others insisted newcomers quarantine in makeshift huts outside the walls. Assuming, of course, the town even allowed you to stay there. And if you were visibly ill, forget entry, forget sympathy. Run, if you can. 3. Movement of goods. Was equally restricted trade could carry contamination, or so authorities believed. Cloth in particular was suspect because it held odours and was transported through multiple hands. Some towns forbade the import of certain items entirely, while others required inspection or delayed unloading. It didn't matter whether you carried grain, wine, spices, or newly crafted shoes. If you came from the wrong direction, everything you owned was considered a potential threat. 4. Rural villages often shut themselves off. Escapees imagined that the countryside would welcome them with open arms. The countryside, meanwhile, imagined escapees as disease-bearing emissaries of doom. Many villages physically blocked roads with stones, felled trees, or simple watchposts. Others warned wanderers that entering without permission was punishable by fines, or, in extreme cases, violence. Flight was possible, yes, but arrival was not guaranteed. The emotional geography of fear, one of the most overlooked aspects of the plague years, is how fear reshaped geography itself, and places that were once linked by kinship, trade and custom became isolated islands of suspicion. Travellers used to rely on hospitality networks, friends of friends, inns, monasteries and relatives. During plague years, these networks frayed. Monasteries were overwhelmed or closed. Inns shuttered, either by decree or because their owners were dead. Friends and relatives might barricade their homes out of caution. In a world where every stranger might carry invisible death, movement became socially unacceptable as much as politically regulated. The wealthy escape, but even they hit walls. Wealthy families had the resources to flee early, often relocating to country estates. But once the panic escalated, even noble travellers encountered resistance. Peasants guarding their villages didn't care about noble birth. They cared about survival. Luxury meant nothing if the locals believed your scented cloak carried contagion. The irony of trying to escape. The tragedy is that fleeing could actually increase risk. Travellers slept outdoors, relied on strangers, congregated on roads, or camped near other refugees. The very act of escaping placed them in contact with more people, and therefore more potential infection. Many chroniclers note cases where individuals fled too late and died en route, their bodies left in fields because no one dared touch them. Escape, in short, wasn't a plan. It was a gamble. The odds were not good. Why ordinances mattered, even when they were wrong. Movement restrictions shaped survival, not because they stopped the plague, it spread anyway, but because they reshaped human behaviour. Communities learned to protect their borders, regulate markets, limit gatherings, scrutinise newcomers, control trade routes, prioritise internal stability over external relations. These measures were blunt, sometimes misguided, but they were also the first attempts at civic pandemic management, centuries before quarantine evolved into a scientific concept. In conclusion, the myth of just leave the city evaporates when you look at what medieval people actually faced. There were rules, there were fears, there were locked gates, suspicious villagers, restrictive ordinances, and communities desperate to keep tragedy outside their walls. Survival was not a matter of running away. It was a matter of navigating a world where every movement, every step toward food, shelter, or safety might be denied by the people you once counted as neighbours or allies. And the dark humour of the era practically writes itself. You try to flee. The town gates reply, absolutely not. Please die locally. In the plague years, even escape required surviving the people trying to keep you out. If plague is a biological disaster, fear is the social one that follows close behind. It spreads faster than infection, mutates more unpredictably than bacteria, and, worst of all, never runs out of targets. By 1348, as death tolls spike and the world feels increasingly unrecognisable, medieval communities begin doing what humans throughout history have done when confronted with chaos they cannot comprehend. They look for someone to blame. The plague kills without pattern, rich and poor, young and old, saintly and sinful, urban and rural. That randomness terrifies people, and when humans cannot find logic in catastrophe, they often try to invent it. The plague kills randomly. Humans try to make it organised. The pressure cooker of 1348. To understand why scapegoating erupts, you must picture the atmosphere of Europe in 1348. Mortality, skyrocketing, bodies accumulating faster than they can be buried, priests overwhelmed, governments issuing frantic ordinances, trade collapsing, social structures trembling, rumours flourishing in the vacuum of reliable information. No one knows what causes plague. No one knows how to stop it, and without a cause, there can be no comfort. So explanations begin to circulate, some whispered, some shouted, some recorded by chroniclers with grim fascination. Some blame the stars, some blame the weather, some blame sinners, some blame invisible vapours. But increasingly, communities look for human agents, real and present, whom they can confront. This marks the beginning of pressure rising beneath the social surface, a tension that will erupt into violence in later years. But even in 1348, the atmosphere is already charged. when minority communities become convenient targets. In many regions, Jewish communities become the primary scapegoats. The logic is tragically familiar. They are different. We do not understand their customs. They live apart. They drink different water. They must be involved. Rumours begin circulating that wells have been poisoned, that rituals involve dangerous substances, or that foreign groups have secretly engineered the catastrophe. These accusations are wholly untrue and profoundly destructive. At first, in 1348, these rumours flicker rather than explode. But everywhere the plague goes, the tension increases. Communities already strained economically and socially now carry a new burden. Suspicion. It simmers, it spreads, and in some regions it begins to boil. Scapegoating is not spontaneous. It grows in the cracks left by fear. Enter Pope Clement VI, a counter-voice. In a world spiralling into chaos, a rare authoritative voice tries to intervene. Pope Clement VI, head of the Church during the plague years. In 1348, from his seat in Avignon, Clement VI issues formal statements condemning the violence and rumours targeting Jews. He tells Christian communities that the plague's devastation is not the result of human conspiracy, and that Jewish populations are suffering from the disease just as grievously. He goes further. He issues papal bulls granting protection to Jews and threatening excommunication for anyone who harms them. In effect, Clement VI says, "This catastrophe is not their fault. Do not turn your fear into cruelty." His intervention is significant because central religious authority carries weight, especially in times when local leadership falters. But fear is difficult to legislate away, and while some regions heed his warnings, others ignore them entirely. Scapegoating continues to simmer beneath the surface, fueled by desperation, grief, and the dangerous human desire to transform chaos into intention. The anatomy of scapegoating. Why does fear turn into persecution so easily? Because fear looks for pattern, and suffering looks for cause, and humans look for control. In 1348, control is in desperately short supply. Communities that feel helpless begin hunting for culprits. This is not unique to plague years. It is a recurring pattern wherever catastrophe strikes. But during the Black Death, the scale of the crisis magnifies everything. Add in ignorance of disease transmission, deep-seated social prejudices, fragmented political authority, widespread grief, and the collapse of routine life, and you get a perfect storm for violence. Rumours have their own momentum. They gain weight with each retelling. They offer simple explanations for complex horrors. They allow people to imagine that if only the culprit could be punished, the nightmare might end. Of course, none of this stops the plague, but it gives terrified minds somewhere to direct their rage, and when people are frightened, they often prefer the comfort of a lie over the emptiness of uncertainty. Not all blame was external. Interestingly, some communities also turn blame inward. Chroniclers describe neighbours accusing each other of neglect, sin, or moral corruption. Some accuse the wealthy of escaping danger. Others accuse the poor of attracting it. Certain towns even blame their own leaders for failing to enact proper ordinances, or for enacting too many. The logic is always shifting because fear has no stable anchor. Why scapegoating matters for understanding survival. Survival during plague years is not just about avoiding infection. It is about avoiding your neighbour's suspicions, your town's anger, and your society's vulnerability to irrational explanations. For minority groups, your survival becomes doubly perilous, surviving the disease and surviving the community's reaction to the disease. Even individuals with no involvement in Jewish communities must navigate the emotional fallout of scapegoating, fear of accusation, fear of association, fear of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, fear of becoming the next convenient explanation. When panic rules, survival becomes political. Clement VI's voice in the chaos. Clement VI's stance does not erase the violence that will soon erupt across Europe in 1349 and 1350, but in 1348 his intervention matters. It provides a counter-narrative. It reminds communities that plague has no moral preference and no human architect. And in a time when many leaders retreat into superstition or paralysis, Clement VI presents an extraordinary, if insufficient, act of intellectual clarity. History will remember him as one of the few who openly defended the truth in the face of fear. Closing note: plague is random. Fear is not. Fear follows social lines, old prejudices, old wounds, old suspicions. It turns illness into accusation, tragedy into violence, and uncertainty into a weapon. The plague kills randomly. Humans tried to make it organised, and in 1348, as tension spreads as rapidly as infection, survival increasingly depends not only on avoiding disease, but on avoiding the disastrous human tendency to turn fear into blame. By 1348, fear is spreading across Europe almost as fast as the plague itself, and with fear comes suspicion, rumour, and the dangerous human instinct to look for someone, anyone, to blame. Minority communities, especially Jews, become the easiest targets. Whispered accusations begin taking shape. They poisoned wells. They conspired with outsiders. They caused the disease. These rumours flare in city squares, marketplaces, taverns, and council halls. And right in the middle of this rising hysteria stands Pope Clement VI, wielding one of the few tools capable of cutting through misinformation in the 14th century: papal authority. While most civic leaders are overwhelmed, panicked, or complicit, Clement VI becomes one of the only institutional voices saying something almost shockingly modern. Stop blaming the Jews. They didn't cause the plague. This is misinformation. July 5th, 1348, Clement VI intervenes. On July 5th, 1348, as accusations intensify and the first violent attacks on Jewish communities erupt, Clement VI issues a papal statement defending Jews against the spreading rumours, and he declares that Jews are dying of the plague at the same rate as Christians, which alone disproves claims of poisoning. His logic is simple and devastating. If Jews created the plague, they would not be dying from it. They are dying, which means they are victims, not perpetrators. In an era when superstition reigns, this is a rare moment of clear, rational messaging from the top of the church hierarchy. But his message is not merely theological, it is political and protective. He understands the consequences if these accusations continue. Europe is on the verge of turning fear into violence on a massive scale. So Clement VI urges Christians to stop spreading false accusations. He urges bishops to preach restraint. He urges rulers to protect their Jewish communities. This is not vague encouragement. This is an institutional attempt to stop a social fire before it becomes a continent-wide inferno. But, as Clement soon realises, one decree is not enough. September the 26th, 1348. The Papal Bull. When rumours continue to intensify through the summer, Clement VI escalates. On September 26, 1348, he issues a formal papal bull declaring unequivocally that Jews are not responsible for the plague. The plague is a natural or divine phenomenon, not a human conspiracy. Anyone attacking or persecuting Jews in response to these rumours is committing a sin. Christian rulers must protect Jews living in their lands. He even reminds the public that Jews are regularly subject to the same tragedies as Christians, including plague, famine, and misfortune. Hardly the characteristics of an all-powerful cabal secretly orchestrating mass death. The bull carries legal consequences as well. Clergy who encourage violence risk punishment. Secular leaders who fail to curb it risk ecclesiastical censure. The Pope is, in essence, using every tool available to push back against collective panic. And it is important to emphasise this. No other institution in 1348 has comparable authority or reach. When Clement speaks, the entire Christian world hears it. Whether they listen is a different matter. Why Clement's intervention matters. In the 14th century, communication is slow, fractured, and mediated through inconsistent local channels. There is no printing press, no rapid dissemination, no centralised policing of public rumour. Yet Clement VI attempts something astonishing. He tries to stop a misinformation epidemic before it becomes a violence epidemic, and he does so not with vague instruction, but with direct statements, grounded arguments, and explicit condemnation of scapegoating. Many leaders blame the Jews. Clement VI does the opposite. He puts the full weight of the papacy behind the message. The plague is not their fault. Leave them alone. The limits of papal authority. But papal words cannot extinguish fear, hunger, grief, or suspicion. Many local governments, militias, and guilds refuse to listen. Some clerics ignore the bull, others twist it, and in several regions, especially in 1349, the violence that Clement warned against erupts anyway. His actions do not stop the tide entirely, but they do provide historical clarity. Not everyone succumbed to hysteria. Not every leader encouraged violence. Someone in 1348 was actively trying to stop the spiral of fear. Then Clement's bulls become essential documents because they reveal the institutional struggle between reason and panic, a struggle as relevant today as it was 7 centuries ago. Why blame was so appealing? Clement deserves credit for attempting to curb hysteria, but we must understand why that hysteria grew in the first place. The plague moved too quickly to comprehend. People watched entire families die in days. Traditional explanations failed. Fear created a void, and humans rushed to fill it. Prejudice supplied ready-made answers. Scapegoating offered something the plague did not, the illusion of control. If you believe someone caused the disaster, then the disaster has a logic. It is not random. It is not divine anger. It is not environmental mystery. It is a conspiracy, something humans can fight, punish, or avenge. And Clement VI tries to break that illusion. He fails in many places, but his attempt matters because it is rooted in compassion and clarity. The humour beat, dark, dry, and accurate. History is full of leaders who respond to crisis with more confusion, more fear, more accusations. Clement VI is unusual because he essentially becomes the medieval equivalent of a fact-checking service. If the papal bull had a modern caption, it would read, "In 1348, even the Pope is basically posting, 'This is misinformation. Stop it.'" Because sometimes the greatest power a leader can wield is simply the courage to say, "The rumour is wrong. The hate is misplaced. The fear is lying to you." And in the plague year of 1348, that courage mattered more than anyone could have known. When people talk about the Black Death, they often picture a distinctly European catastrophe: London's mass graves, Siena's collapse, Florence's despair. But the plague was never a regional tragedy. It was a Mediterranean-wide and ultimately Afro-Eurasian event, sweeping across continents with an indifference that made borders meaningless. To understand its true scale, we have to widen the map, step past Europe's city walls, and look south across the sea toward Tunis, where the great historian Ibn Khaldun lived through one of the most traumatic episodes of his life. Today, Ibn Khaldun is celebrated as one of the most brilliant thinkers of the medieval world, a founding figure of sociology, economics, historiography, and political theory. But in 1348 to 1349, he was not yet a scholar, not yet a statesman. He was a teenager watching his world disintegrate. And like every teenager in the 14th century, he received absolutely zero emotional support from the universe during a crisis that made adulthood arrive far too quickly. The plague reaches North Africa. The wave that struck Europe in 1347 to 1351 hit the Islamic world just as violently. Trade routes, caravans, coastal shipping lanes, and diplomatic networks ensured that no region orbiting the Mediterranean escaped untouched. Tunis, a thriving intellectual and commercial centre, was especially vulnerable. Its position along North African trade corridors linked it to Egypt, the Maghreb, southern Europe, and the wider Islamic world. Everything that made Tunis prosperous, mobility, commerce, regional influence, made it an ideal entry point for plague. By 1348, the disease arrives. By 1349, it devastates. Where Ibn Khaldun describes the impact not as a chronicler of distant history, but as a survivor living amid loss. In one of the most quietly heartbreaking autobiographical passages of the medieval period, he recounts how the plague overtook his homeland and how he was left alone among all his people. Behind those simple words is a reality far more brutal. He lost both of his parents in the 1348 to 1349 wave. He was 16 or 17 years old. His formative education was suddenly reshaped, not by tutors or scholars, but by grief. What Tunis looked like in the plague years. While European chroniclers describe shallow graves, collapsed families, and overwhelmed clergy, Islamic writers across North Africa report parallel scenes. Streets emptied of life, markets shuttered scholars, officials, and merchants dying in astonishing numbers, entire branches of prominent families extinguished, administrative systems struggling to function, religious gatherings suspended or transformed. Cities like Tunis, Cairo, Damascus, and Aleppo were centres of scholarship, trade, and government. When plague hit, it didn't just kill individuals, it killed teachers, imams, scribes, judges, merchants, architects, tax officials, artisans, sailors, and entire clusters of interdependent professions. The intellectual world Ibn Khaldun grew up in, rich with poetry, jurisprudence, philosophy, and historical writing, was suddenly devastated. Mentor networks collapsed. Political institutions faltered. Cultural continuity was interrupted. The teenager who would one day analyse civilizations was watching his own unravel in real time. A scholar, formed in the shadow of loss, Ibn Khaldun's later writings reveal a mind obsessed with cycles, the rise and fall of dynasties, the strength and decay of social cohesion, asabiya, the fragility of prosperity, the inevitability of political entropy. Scholars today often point out that these theories feel eerily shaped by his personal experience of plague. When you lose your family at 17, when you watch your society stagger under the weight of catastrophe, when your childhood ends not gradually but abruptly, you learn that civilization is not stable. You learn that survival is temporary. You learn that human systems break easily. And that lesson never leaves you. In his famous Muqaddimah, written decades later, where Ibn Khaldun describes the plague of the 14th century as an event that devastated nations and caused populations to vanish, his words carry not the abstraction of a historian but the sting of memory. The plague as a global event, Ibn Khaldun's experience reminds us that the Black Death cannot be understood through a Europe-only lens. By 1348 to 1349, plague was tearing through. North Africa, Tunis, Fez, Tlemcen, Cairo, the Levant, Damascus, Jerusalem, Aleppo, the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, Central Asia, southern Spain, Sicily, the Byzantine territories. In every region, the symptoms were the same, the mortality staggering, and the emotional fallout almost identical. Families broken, economies destabilised, scholars lost, orphans left behind, political orders strained. In every region, people turned to God, to scholarship, to charity, to fatalism, or to flight. And in every region, the plague advanced with the same implacable rhythm. The Mediterranean basin, Muslim, Christian, Jewish and otherwise, was not divided by the disease. It was united by suffering. Why expanding the map matters plague history is richer, more complex and more human when we remember that worlds beyond Europe were equally overwhelmed. Ibn Khaldun is not just a witness from a different geography. He is proof that the Black Death shaped intellectual history from Marrakesh to Cairo as profoundly as it shaped Florence or London. When he later wrote about the fragility of states, the vulnerability of dynasties, and the impermanence of human achievement, he was not writing in the abstract. He had lived through a formative trauma that confirmed every one of those theories. It is no exaggeration to say that the 1348 to 1349 plague wave shaped one of the greatest minds of the medieval world. Tragedy became his tutor, survival became his first education, loss became his inheritance, or, put another way, History's greatest thinkers got their education from tragedy and zero emotional support. Closing reflection. By turning to Ibn Khaldun, we widen the lens of the Black Death narrative. This was not a European disaster, it was a world event, reshaping the intellectual, cultural and political landscapes of multiple civilizations. The plague did not just kill, it transformed. It redirected lives, accelerated insights, and left thinkers like Ibn Khaldun forever marked by what they endured. And in that sense, his voice, quiet, reflective, are wounded, is a reminder that the story of the Black Death stretches far beyond any single city or continent. It is the story of a world shaken, reshaped, and somehow still thinking. When historians try to understand how people behaved during the Black Death, how they panicked, coped, reorganised their lives, or simply tried to stay sane, they often turn to records, ordinances, or letters. But none of those sources capture the human experience with the immediacy of literature, and no literary source captures the psychological and social landscape of Plague-era Italy better than Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron. Written in the aftermath of the 1348 disaster in Florence, the Decameron is often remembered as a collection of witty, bawdy, occasionally scandalous stories. But beneath the laughter lies something deeper, a survival document, not of medicine, not of governance, but of culture, a mirror showing how humans try to rebuild meaning when the world outside has become unrecognisable. To understand the text is to understand what plague does to society, how people reorganise life when death becomes normal. Boccaccio as eyewitness. The city breaking down. Before the storytelling even begins, Boccaccio gives us one of the most vivid descriptions of plague-stricken Florence. It is not a chronicle in the dry administrative sense. It is emotional, it is visual, it is brutally honest. He describes neighbours abandoning one another, families refusing to nurse their own members, people dropping dead in streets' funeral rites, collapsing mass graves, swallowing thousands, fear transforming polite society into something feral. Boccaccio tells us that people responded to the crisis in wildly different ways. Some partied, insisting the only sensible response to death was pleasure. Some locked themselves indoors, determined to outwait the plague in solitude. Some fled, hoping the countryside offered cleaner air and safer conditions. Some embraced religious extremity, believing self-punishment pleased God. Some surrendered to apathy, no longer caring who lived or died. His description doesn't merely report what happened, it reveals how plague disorders society at every level. When death becomes routine, behaviour becomes unpredictable. Norms disintegrate, even identity shifts. People stop functioning as part of a collective and begin acting like isolated survival units. Boccaccio isn't moralising, he's recording, and what he records is a city losing its composure because the world it depended on no longer makes sense. Storytelling as survival. While the plague ravages Florence, Boccaccio's fictional frame narrative introduces 10 young Florentines, 7 women and 3 men, who flee the city and take refuge in a villa in the countryside. Safe from the chaos, they reorganise their days around structure, beauty and companionship. Each day they tell stories, 100 stories total. In this sense, the Decameron is more than entertainment. It is a survival mechanism. Through storytelling, the characters, and perhaps the readers, accomplish several things. 1. They reclaim control of time. In the city, time belongs to chaos, measured by death tolls and funerary bells. At the villa, time becomes orderly again, divided into mornings, afternoons and evenings, each with ritual and purpose. 2. They rebuild social bonds. Where Florence's crisis dissolves relationships, the group consciously reconstructs community. They choose leaders, they share responsibilities, they create systems for interaction. 3. They reassert humanity through humour and desire. In a world where suffering dominates, the act of laughing, even about ridiculous, risque or foolish behaviour, is an act of resistance. 4. They create meaning where reality offers none. Death does not stop outside their walls, but inside life is reimagined. This is not escapism in the shallow sense. It is psychological first aid. Here, Boccaccio is showing us how people cope when the external world collapses, not only by fleeing physically, but by redirecting emotional energy into stories that preserve dignity, humour, and community. What the stories reveal about plague psychology. The stories themselves are not about plague. They're about clever tricks, misbehaving clergy, romantic schemes, disastrous misunderstandings, unexpected fortunes, foolish mistakes, triumphs of wit over authority. Why avoid plague in the storytelling? Because the Decameron is a world in which characters reclaim what plague stole: agency, cleverness, desire, laughter, human connection. If the plague makes death normal, then storytelling makes life normal again. And this is the most revealing detail. Boccaccio shows that people facing existential terror do not always respond with despair, and sometimes they respond with imagination. Boccaccio as a cultural lens. Through Boccaccio, we understand behaviours that historical records cannot fully explain. Why people fled, not because they were heartless, but because they were overwhelmed. Why some indulged in pleasure, not because they were immoral, but because pleasure was the only antidote to omnipresent death. Why some isolated themselves completely, because self-preservation felt like the only rational option. Why social order dissolved, because prolonged crisis erodes every boundary. Boccaccio shows that the plague didn't create new human impulses, it magnified existing ones. Fear became sharper, excess became wilder, love became more desperate, laughter became more necessary. He uses literature not just to portray survival, but to diagnose it. The humour beat, a truth wrapped in irony. Humour in the Decameron is not escapist fluff, it is a coping strategy, and nothing captures the chapter's theme better than its ironic summary: how people reorganise life when death becomes normal. Because in the countryside villa, that's exactly what they do. They rebuild life deliberately, through structure, companionship, narrative, and joy. Closing reflection. If laws show how governments responded to plague, and graves show how bodies were managed, and chronicles show how fear spread, then the Decameron shows how the mind survived. It is a reminder that in moments when the world breaks, people reach for whatever tools they have, stories, rituals, friendships, to make it whole again. And through Boccaccio's eyes, we see that even in the deadliest years of the 14th century, humanity was still inventing ways to feel alive. By the time 1351 arrives, the physical terror of the Black Death has finally begun to ease across England. The wave that started in 1348 has burned through towns, villages and manors with horrifying speed, leaving fields untilled, workshops empty, and entire communities hollowed out. But now a new problem emerges, one far less deadly, yet deeply disruptive. The survivors realise they are suddenly valuable. Labourers, servants, ploughmen, shepherds, carpenters, masons, everyone whose work kept medieval society functioning, are now in critically short supply. A staggering percentage of the workforce is gone. Fields desperately need hands. Lords desperately need workers. Towns desperately need craftsmen. And for the first time in living memory, the people who usually had no bargaining power suddenly hold all the cards, and that, of course, is when the government steps in. Because nothing alarms medieval authorities quite like ordinary people discovering they're essential. The good news? You lived. The bad news? The government noticed you might ask for a raise. The England of 1351, a country reshaped by loss. To understand why the English crown intervenes, you must picture England in the early 1350s. The plague has killed so many rural labourers that agricultural production is breaking down. Manorial lords complain that tenants refuse traditional obligations. Landowners offer higher wages to lure scarce workers. Craftsmen begin naming their own prices. It is, in short, the first major labour shortage in English history. And while survivors see opportunity, better wages, better conditions, even mobility, the ruling class sees only chaos. This tension between opportunity and control becomes the defining political question of post-plague England. Enter the Statute of Labourers, 1351. On 9 February 1351, under the reign of Edward III, the Parliament of England enacts what becomes one of the most infamous economic laws of the Middle Ages, the Statute of Labourers. If the name sounds bureaucratic, the content is anything but. The statute is essentially the government shouting, "Workers, stop enjoying your bargaining power. Lords, you can go back to paying pre-plague wages. Everyone calm down." The statute orders, wages must return to pre-1348 levels. No more price hikes, no more negotiating, no more supply and demand. Workers cannot leave their employer without good cause. Mobility is suddenly a threat, not a right. Able-bodied people must work if offered employment. Idleness becomes borderline criminal. Those paying higher wages can be punished. The law targets both workers and employers. Officials must enforce these rules aggressively. Just surviving the plague inadvertently makes you a legal subject of state scrutiny. In essence, Parliament tries to freeze the labour market in time, locking wages into the pre-plague economy, even though the post-plague world is dramatically different. Why Edward III and Parliament care. So much. The English economy of the 1350s is not just a matter of local production. England is fighting the 100 Years' War, depending heavily on agricultural output, tax revenue and feudal obligations. If wages rise uncontrollably, landowners lose income. If labour moves freely, manorial structures collapse. If peasants sense their own leverage, the social hierarchy wobbles. Edward III's government sees this as nothing less than a national emergency. They fear the decline of feudal loyalty, the weakening of noble estates, the erosion of traditional obligations, the loss of state control over the economy. So the legislation is not merely economic, it is ideological. It attempts to preserve the medieval order after the plague has shattered its foundations. Survivors versus the state. A silent battle. The Statute of Labourers creates an immediate tension. The living want better lives, and the government wants things to go back to normal. But normal died in 1348. Although the law threatens fines, the reality on the ground is more complicated. Many workers continue demanding higher wages. Lords often break the rules when desperate for labour. Officials struggle to enforce the statute uniformly. Market forces quietly undermine legal commands. The statute becomes a line in the sand that nature itself refuses to respect. Yet despite widespread non-compliance, the law remains symbolically powerful. It signals that England's ruling class is frightened, not of the plague now, but of the social mobility it inadvertently created. A world permanently changed. Even though the government tries to halt wage inflation, the economic structure of England has already begun to shift. Serfdom weakens because tenants can negotiate. Wage labour grows as work becomes more transactional. Peasants gain leverage that previous generations never imagined. Urban migration increases with craftsmen seeking better terms in towns. The Statute of Labourers is, in effect, the medieval attempt to put a lid on a boiling pot. But the pressure keeps rising, and though Parliament will reaffirm and modify labour laws repeatedly in the following decades, the social transformation set in motion by the plague proves unstoppable. The humour beat, a bureaucratic punchline. The bitter irony of 1351 is almost comedic. People survive a plague that killed half their neighbours, crawl out of the wreckage of their communities, return to the fields and workshops, and are promptly told, "Congratulations on surviving. Now please accept this legally mandated pay cut." It is one of history's great bureaucratic mood killers. Closing reflection. The Statute of Labourers reveals something profound about survival. Surviving the biological disaster of the Black Death was only the beginning. The social and economic fallout was its own battlefield. In 1351, English workers learned that surviving gives you power, but power makes you visible, and visibility draws the attention of the state. Edward III and Parliament try to hold medieval society together with legislation. Survivors, newly aware of their worth, push against those boundaries. The result is a quiet, nation-defining struggle that reshapes England for centuries. Because if plague rewrites the body count, policy rewrites the world the survivors inherit. By the late 1300s, Europe has endured multiple waves of plague. The first catastrophe of 1347 to 1351 shattered populations. Later flare-ups reminded every port city that the Black Death was not a single nightmare, but a recurring threat. And nowhere did this reality strike harder than in the bustling maritime hubs that connected the Mediterranean world through trade. This is where the story of 1377 begins, on the Adriatic coast, in the commercial republic of Dubrovnik, then known as Ragusa, one of the most important trading ports of the medieval world. Ragusa survives on commerce. Ships from Italy, Greece, the Levant, and North Africa pass through its harbours daily. Its prosperity depends on welcoming outsiders, merchants, sailors, diplomats, pilgrims. But by 1377, every port official, every ship owner, and every city council member knows one terrifying truth. A single infected sailor can bring the next plague wave. So what does Ragusa do? It invents something revolutionary, something that will become a cornerstone of public health for the next 600 plus years. For the first time in recorded history, a government mandates a 30-day isolation period for all arrivals, the Trentina. This is not medicine as we understand it. This is not germ theory. This is governance reshaped by fear, economics, and survival. It is the moment when humanity learns that sometimes the safest thing to do is simply wait. Or, as Ragusa effectively tells incoming sailors, "Welcome to port. Please enjoy our luxury 30-day vacation in isolation with suspicion." Ragusa in 1377, a city balancing trade and terror. Ragusa thrives because it sits at a crossroads. Venetian merchants sail in, Ottoman envoys pass through, Genoese traders arrive laden with goods. Ragusa cannot afford to shut down traffic entirely. But plague has made the city cautious. Governments have tried everything: ordinances, fines, burial rules, movement restrictions. Yet nothing truly stops plague at the border. So Ragusa's Great Council makes a startling decision in July 1377. No person from plague-affected regions may enter Ragusa until they have spent 30 days on one of the designated islands or quarantine stations. This 30-day waiting period, the Trentina, is the earliest fully documented state-enforced quarantine in world history. Ragusa chooses specific isolation areas, including the nearby islands of Mercan, Bobera and others, purposely keeping arrivals far from the main population. These are not hotels. These are containment zones, simple shelters, guarded perimeters, and strict surveillance. For merchants used to swift trade deals, it is an infuriating delay. For city officials, it is a life-saving buffer. Why 30 days? The mathematics of medieval fear. Ragusa doesn't know about Yersinia pestis. It doesn't know about fleas. It doesn't know about incubation periods in the scientific sense. But it knows patterns. Through bitter experience, Ragusan authorities observe plague symptoms usually appear within a few days of travel. People who seem healthy when disembarking might become dangerously ill shortly after. Allowing immediate entry is essentially gambling with the city's entire population. So they calculate a window. 30 days, a full Trentina, is long enough to reveal whether a traveller is sick. If they survive the waiting period without symptoms, they are considered safe enough to enter the city. This is proto-epidemiology built from empirical observation, rather than scientific understanding. Ragusa is turning experiential knowledge into civic policy, and it works. Commerce creates the first quarantine. The most remarkable aspect of the Trentina is not that it exists, it's why it exists. Quarantine emerges not from monasteries, not from physicians, and not from scholars. It emerges from harbour officials trying to protect trade merchants, trying to keep the economy alive, city councils trying to prevent population collapse, administrators balancing risk and prosperity. This is public health born from commerce, not science. Ragusa understands a simple truth. A dead city cannot trade. So rather than shut its gates entirely, like some inland towns, or allow unchecked entry, as many ports disastrously did, Ragusa invents a compromise: let the world come, but only after waiting long enough to prove they are not a threat. It is governance shaped by necessity. The Human Experience of Quarantine, 1377 edition. What does isolation look like for medieval travellers? You arrive at Ragusa after weeks at sea. Instead of unloading cargo, you're told to sail to an offshore island. Guards monitor your group. Food is delivered with minimal contact. Departure is forbidden until the 30-day period ends. Any sign of illness means extended isolation, or worse. Imagine the emotional range. Frustration. Your business deals are evaporating. Fear. Any cough might be fatal. Boredom. There is nothing to do except wait and hope. Suspicion. Everyone watches everyone else for symptoms. It is quarantine in its earliest and rawest form. Not humane, not comfortable, but undeniably effective. Why Ragusa's invention matters. The Trentina becomes the foundation for the later Quarantina, a 40-day isolation period adopted widely in Venice and other maritime republics in the 15th century. The very word quarantine comes from this later 40-day model. But Ragusa is the pioneer. Its 1377 decree shows us that by the late 14th century, governance has fundamentally changed. Cities are willing to restrict individual freedoms for public safety. Ports view disease control as part of economic strategy. Plague is no longer treated as solely divine punishment, but as something manageable through human action. This is one of the earliest examples of policy-based epidemic management, a civic defense against an invisible killer. It marks a pivot point where survival depends on bureaucracy as much as on luck. The humour beat. Ragusa. The world's first. Your room isn't ready yet. If medieval port officials had been required to deliver customer service announcements, they might have said something like, "Welcome to Ragusa. Please enjoy your complimentary 30-day stay in a hut on an isolated rock where no one trusts you." It is the first time in history that waiting becomes a medical procedure. Closing reflection. The year 1377 is a milestone in the story of the Black Death, not because of how many people died, but because of how societies learned to live afterward. Ragusa's Trentina shows a world adapting, inventing, and reshaping itself through trial and error. In a century defined by plague, this Adriatic port teaches us something profound. Survival is not just about endurance, it is about innovation, and sometimes the most radical innovation of all is simply forcing everyone to stop, breathe, and wait. 7 centuries after the Black Death tore through the 14th century world, you might hope that modern science and historical research have tied everything up neatly, placed a tidy bow on it, and declared the mystery solved. Unfortunately, historians and scientists are human, which means they do what humans always do when confronting incomplete evidence. They argue, and the Black Death, despite its terrifying clarity and impact, still leaves us with unanswered questions, competing theories, and a long list of scholarly debates that refuse to die. What we do know today is astonishing. What we don't know is equally important. And what we thought we knew continues to evolve as new genetic, archaeological, and climatic evidence emerges. But let's take this step by step. Transmission. Fleas, rodents, humans, all of the above. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, the dominant explanation for the Black Death was simple. Infected fleas to infected rats to infected humans. End of story. Lecture over. Please collect your diploma. But recent scholarship has complicated this picture. The flea/rodent model. We know Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible, thrives in flea guts and can move through rodent populations with devastating speed. Studies of ancient DNA from plague cemeteries like East Smithfield confirm that the medieval strain is closely related to the modern flea-borne varieties. This model explains dramatic die-offs in rodent populations, rapid geographic spread along trade routes, bubonic symptoms with swollen lymph nodes, buboes. Yet it struggles to explain everything, particularly the speed and seasonality of some outbreaks, the pneumonic transmission model. Some scholars argue that widespread pneumonic plague, transmitted human to human through respiratory droplets, played a larger role than traditionally believed. Pneumonic plague can kill within days and spreads efficiently in crowded, poorly ventilated settings. This model accounts for explosive household-level collapse winter outbreaks, when fleas are less active, chroniclers' descriptions of people falling dead suddenly. But pneumonic plague usually requires close contact, and the Black Death often moved faster and farther than this model alone predicts. Hybrid and ecological models. The current emerging consensus: it was both, and more. Recent studies suggest waves of bubonic plague spread via fleas and rodents, with intermittent bursts of pneumonic plague among humans, influenced by climate-driven changes in rodent populations and facilitated by medieval patterns of trade, warfare and movement. In other words, the Black Death was not a single, simple model. It was a multi-system ecological catastrophe. And yes, historians are still debating the ratios. What counts as the Black Death? Historians are still fighting about it. You would think something that killed tens of millions of people would be easy to define. But historians disagree on what exactly we should call the Black Death. There are two competing frameworks. One, the narrow view. The Black Death equals the 1347 to 1351 pandemic in Europe, the Middle East and North Africa. This definition focuses on the dramatic initial wave. 2. The broad view. The Black Death equals the entire second pandemic cycle, lasting from the mid-14th century through the 18th century, including repeated outbreaks across Europe and the Islamic world. In this view, 1347 to 1351 is just Act 1 of a centuries-long horror story. Why does the debate matter? Because how we define the Black Death shapes, how we interpret mortality data, how we compare outbreaks, how we model historical population change, how we integrate modern genetic findings, and academics, being academics, will absolutely die on their definitional hills. Origins, following the genetics backward. For centuries, the origin theories wandered across maps, from China to Central Asia to the Crimea. Chroniclers gave contradictory clues, trade routes connected everything to everything, and medieval record-keeping was, let's say, enthusiastically inconsistent. But recent genomic research, particularly analysis of ancient Y. pestis strains, has pinpointed a likely origin: the Tian Shan region, near the modern border of Kyrgyzstan, in Central Asia. Pollen studies, climate data, and ancient cemeteries, notably the Kara-Jigach graves from the 1330s, suggest plague emerged or re-emerged there before radiating outward along trade routes toward the Black Sea, then into the Mediterranean. This discovery is not final. Origins research is still young, but it's currently the strongest evidence we have, and it reinforces a key point. The Black Death was born not in a city, but in an interplay of climate, ecology, rodents, bacteria, and human networks. Modern reality. Check. Plague still exists. Plague never vanished. Today, Yersinia pestis persists in wildlife reservoirs across the world. The American southwest Madagascar parts of China, Mongolia, Central Asia, Eastern Africa. Several thousand human cases occur each decade worldwide. But here's the difference. Antibiotics work. If treated early, modern plague has a high survival rate. We cannot prevent the bacterium from existing. Nature has made sure of that. But we can prevent it from turning into another medieval-style disaster. Public health infrastructure, sanitation, surveillance systems, and scientific literacy make it nearly impossible for plague to behave today the way it did in 1348. Still, the outbreaks in remote regions remind us that the organism responsible for one of history's deadliest events is very much alive. Why we're still fascinated and still debating. The Black Death is not just a medical event, it is a historical earthquake. It reshaped economies, labour shortages, wage tensions. It disrupted governments, new laws, new controls. It transformed religion, art, and philosophy. It left emotional scars that shaped chroniclers, storytellers, and thinkers. It rewired the medieval world into something fundamentally different. Every new discovery, genetic, archaeological, sociological, adds another layer to our understanding. And the debates, they don't weaken the story. They show how alive this history still is. The good news? You survived the 1300s plague. The bad news? Humanity kept all the worst habits, especially blaming each other. 700 years later, the bacterium is still here, the debates are still here, and human nature, messy, brilliant, stubborn, remains exactly what it was in 1348. We know more now. We fear differently. We argue with better footnotes. But the story of the Black Death is ultimately a story about us. Our mistakes, our resilience, our curiosity, and our endless habit of trying to make sense of a world that refuses to behave.